Hey guys, tonight we're travelling to a place where winters weren't just cold, they were a test of survival. A world of frosted windows, endless snow, and apartments that never quite kept the chill out. We're going back to the Soviet Union, where the simple act of trying to fall asleep in winter was less about comfort and more about endurance. Forget any image of cosy cabins with fireplaces or soft feather beds. For millions of people, sleep was something you earned after a day of scarcity, in conditions that were often bitterly unforgiving. Before we dive in, take a moment to like the video if this is your kind of late night history, and subscribe if you'd like more journeys like this one. Let me know in the comments where you're listening from and what the weather is like outside your window right now. It's always interesting to see the contrast between our modern comforts and the past struggles we're exploring. Now, settle into your blankets, maybe dim the lights, and let the sound of the night carry you. Imagine the year is 1953. Stalin has just died, rationing is still remembered, and you're standing in the corridor of a crumbling apartment block in Moscow. The air outside is below freezing. The air inside isn't much better. You're tired from waiting in line all day for bread. Your body aches from work, and all you want is to lie down. But in this world, sleep is never simple. It's a negotiation with the cold, with hunger, and with the people you live alongside. Congratulations. You've just been dropped into the Soviet winter night. The good news is you made it home. The bad news is your home is as frigid as the street outside. You open your eyes to the kind of cold that seeps into your bones before you even register you're awake. It's not the gentle chill of an autumn breeze or the refreshing crispness of a winter morning walk. This is the kind of cold that settles in your marrow, heavy and sharp, making every movement feel like punishment. The Soviet apartment you're waking up in has walls so thin you can hear the neighbour coughing through them, but somehow too thick to let in even a whisper of warmth from the sun. Not that the sun is much help. It barely rises this time of year, and when it does, its light glances off the frost-covered glass without offering the slightest hint of heat. You're lying under a blanket that isn't really a blanket at all, but a patchwork of heavy wool and whatever scraps of fabric your family could salvage years ago. It weighs down on you like a slab of concrete, and yet somehow it still isn't enough. Your breath comes out in pale clouds, lingering in the air above your face like small ghosts. You roll onto your side, but that doesn't help. The mattress is lumpy, uneven, and smells faintly of mildew, like every drop of condensation that's ever formed on the walls has trickled down and soaked into the stuffing. Springs poke through in awkward angles, reminding you with every shift of your body that comfort is not part of this arrangement. Your first thought isn't about getting up, but about how long you can stay wrapped up before you absolutely have to face the air outside the covers. You know what's waiting for you. The cruel slap of icy air on exposed skin. The shock of bare feet against a floor that feels closer to stone than wood. You pull the blanket tighter, but the draft sneaks in anyway. It always does. The window frame doesn't quite fit. The cracks around it stuffed with newspaper to keep the worst of the wind out. But wind finds a way, whistling faintly, shaking the frost on the glass, reminding you that nature doesn't care about Soviet walls or Soviet lives. It simply presses against every weak spot until it wins. You glance around the room, though room is generous. It's more like a corner carved out of shared space. In many Soviet apartments, several families live together, divided not by walls but by the fragile illusion of privacy. Curtains strung across, wardrobes pushed into awkward places, chalk lines on the floor. You're lucky if you even have this much space to yourself. The furniture is mismatched, inherited from relatives or salvaged from someone else's discard pile. A chipped dresser leans against one wall. A chair with a broken leg sits unused, but still taking up space. In the corner, a pile of shoes, some with holes worn clear through the soles, some too small, but kept just in case, reminds you that everything has to be saved, because everything might be needed again. The sounds of the apartment begin to intrude. Someone in the next room is stoking the stove, though stove might just mean a blackened metal box that eats more wood and coal than the family can really spare. The smell of smoke seeps under the door, sharp and raw, mixing with the faint odour of last night's boiled cabbage. Pipes groan somewhere behind the wall, rattling as if they too are struggling against the cold. The radiators are supposed to help, but they only work when the central heating decides to cooperate. Some nights they're hot enough to burn your hand if you touch them. Other nights, like this one, they're stone cold, a useless hunk of iron that only makes you angry when you look at it. You rub your arms, trying to get some warmth into them, but the air is thick with chill. Even your skin feels brittle, like it could crack. You try to stretch your legs and regret it immediately because your toes hit the icy edge of the blanket and curl back instinctively. You know you need to get up. There's work to be done, errands to run, bread lines to stand in. But your body is heavy with fatigue, not just from the day before, but from every day before. It's the kind of exhaustion that doesn't fade with rest, because rest isn't restful here. Sleep is shallow, broken by the cold, by the noises of the apartment, by the arguments of neighbours, by the clatter of boots in the stairwell at odd hours. Sometimes you wake with your heart racing, not from dreams, but from the sound of heavy knocking on someone's door down the hall, and the silence that follows when it's answered. You lie there a little longer, trying to convince yourself to move. You hear a child crying faintly through the wall. You hear water dripping slowly somewhere in the building, maybe from a pipe, maybe from a ceiling leak. The cold sharpens every sound, carrying it farther, making it impossible to ignore. You bury your face in the blanket, but the smell of unwashed wool and smoke fills your nose. There's no escape from it, only endurance. Finally, you sit up. The air hits you like a slap. You shiver so hard your teeth clack together, and your breath comes out faster. You glance at the window again. The frost is spread in delicate patterns across the glass, almost beautiful if you weren't so aware of what it means. Your hand reaches out from the blanket, hesitates in the freezing air, then pulls the fabric tighter around your shoulders as you force yourself upright. Your feet find the floor, and the cold shoots up your legs like fire in reverse. Every board creaks under your weight, and for a moment you wonder if the whole building is sighing at the effort of keeping everyone alive through another night. The room looks the same as it always does in the morning. Bleak, tired, waiting. Nothing changes. The wallpaper is peeling, yellowed at the corners, patterned with small flowers you barely notice anymore. The ceiling is stained from years of damp. A single bare light bulb dangles on a wire, unlit, because electricity is rationed and expensive, and you don't need it yet. The blanket slips from your shoulders and immediately you want to dive back under it, but you don't. There's no time for that. You shuffle toward the small basin in the corner, where a pitcher of water sits half frozen, a thin crust of ice forming at the top. You break it with your hand, the sting immediate, your skin red and burning from the shock. You splash your face, gasping at the cold, then wipe it off with a rag that never quite dries, always damp, always smelling faintly of mould. Hygiene is relative. You do what you can with what you have, which is almost nothing. In the next room, someone coughs again. Someone else is already clattering pots, starting the day's slow ritual of boiling water, stretching food, finding ways to make not enough seem like something. The smells creep in through the cracks in the door, mingling with the smoke, the damp, the lingering sweat from a dozen bodies sharing too little space. You're not awake yet, but you're not asleep anymore either. You're simply existing in that grey zone where tiredness becomes a permanent condition. The floor is littered with yesterday's traces, scraps of newspaper, an empty glass, crumbs hardened to the boards. You pick your way around them, not because it matters, but because bending down in this cold is unbearable. Your body resists every movement. The cold stiffens your joints, slows your blood, makes you feel twice as old as you are. You're in your 30s, but your knees ache like they belong to a 70-year-old. You sit back down on the bed for a moment, unable to summon the energy to keep moving. The blanket is still rumpled there, still heavy, still calling you back. You resist. The window groans again as the wind pushes against it. The newspaper stuffed cracks, rattling faintly. A small flake of snow has pushed its way through, melting into a drop of water that slides down the sill and disappears. You watch it for a moment, strangely hypnotized. Outside, the city is blanketed in snow, endless grey and white, broken only by the dark lines of tram tracks and the slow movement of people bundled in layers of rags and coats, huddled against the wind. You know you'll be one of them soon, trudging through the snow to wherever you have to go, wishing you could stay here, under the heavy blanket, even if it never truly kept you warm. You pull on your clothes, the fabric stiff and scratchy, holding the chill like it's part of its nature. The wool socks don't help. They're worn thin at the heels, damp from yesterday, impossible to dry in this climate. Your boots sit by the bed, cracked leather that leaks in the snow, but still better than nothing. You lace them slowly, fingers numb, every knot an effort. The scarf is scratchy, the coat heavy, but without them, you'd never make it outside. You take one last look at the bed. It looks like a pile of fabric more than a place to sleep. You can already feel tonight's cold waiting there for you. Already imagine the fight to fall asleep again, curled up in layers, hoping the radiators decide to work, hoping the draft doesn't get worse. But for now, you leave it behind. You open the door, and the hallway greets you with more cold, more noise, more life packed too tightly into crumbling walls. And this is how a Soviet winter morning begins. Not with rest, not with comfort, but with the cold dragging you out of bed before you're ready, into a day that promises no warmth and no mercy. The place where you sleep isn't really a bedroom, not in the way you picture one now, with its door you can close, a mattress that belongs to you, and 4 walls meant to give you privacy. In a Soviet winter, your so-called bedroom is simply the space you've managed to carve out of something bigger and louder, something never meant to be peaceful. It might be the corner of a communalka, one of those sprawling communal apartments where 3 4, sometimes 7 families live together, each with their own cluster of belongings, stacked like fortifications against everyone else's lives. Curtains serve as walls, furniture is arranged as borders, and the line between your home and your neighbours is as thin as a squeaky wardrobe pushed to the wrong side of the room. The result is that sleeping doesn't happen in quiet. It happens in the middle of other people's sounds and smells. You can hear a baby crying 2 meters away. That doesn't belong to you. You can smell fish frying at midnight because your neighbour's shift work ends late, and the only place he can cook is the shared kitchen. You can hear someone muttering to themselves after too much vodka, the words slurred and low, but not low enough to ignore. Your little corner is supposed to feel like yours, but it never really does. Every noise reminds you that the walls don't belong to you. The bed doesn't belong to you. And even the silence doesn't belong to you because someone else can take it away whenever they want. If you were lucky enough to have your own room, maybe because your family secured one back when the apartment was first divided, it still isn't really a bedroom. The space might once have been a living room in a pre-revolutionary apartment, or a dining room with a chandelier long since removed, or a study meant for one wealthy family that now houses 4 working-class people. The ceilings are high, which only means there's more cold air gathering above you, drifting down in invisible sheets that remind you of the space's original design. The ornate moulding might still cling to the corners near the ceiling, faded paint curling like paper left in the sun. You don't look at it often, because it only reminds you that this place wasn't built for you, and that no matter how many decades pass, it still isn't yours. Your bed isn't really a bed either. It's a metal frame inherited from some relative, the paint peeling in flakes that fall to the floor like dust whenever you move it. The mattress is thin and stuffed with whatever filler could be found when it was made. Horsehair, if you're lucky, straw if you're not, clumps of cotton that have long since compressed into hard lumps that never spring back. Springs jab into your back, shifting under your weight. Every creak is loud enough to wake the person in the next corner, which means you try not to move much once you've found a position, even if that position leaves you stiff and sore by morning. Sheets are a luxury. Most of the time, it's just a rough cover pulled over the mattress, washed so rarely that it carries the smell of months of bodies pressed against it. Above you, frost creeps along the walls, curling into patterns that might be beautiful if you weren't the one sleeping under them. In the night, you can feel the damp settling in. Your blanket gets heavier, not because it's warm, but because moisture clings to it, making the wool thicker, pressing down on you like a second body. You breathe into it for warmth, your own breath bouncing back in your face, dampening the fabric even more. You wake sometimes with the edge of the blanket frozen stiff, where your exhalation soaked it through. That's not unusual. That's just what happens here. In some apartments, people don't even have beds of their own. A couch during the day becomes a sleeping space at night, the cushions rearranged, the blankets pulled out of a chest, the whole ritual repeated daily. Children sleep 2 or 3 to a bed, their legs tangled together under a pile of blankets, arguing about who gets to sleep against the wall where it's warmer. Adults sometimes sleep in shifts, especially if there's only one real bed in the family. One person gets it for the first part of the night, another takes over in the early hours before dawn. Everyone pretends it works fine. The furniture doubles as storage. Every corner of the space is packed with something because you can't throw things away. A broken chair leg, a stack of jars, a pile of fabric scraps, they're all kept because someday they might be needed. And so your bedroom isn't just a bedroom, it's also a warehouse of survival. You might sleep next to a stack of firewood, or under shelves crowded with pickled vegetables sealed in glass jars that sweat in the cold. The smell of vinegar seeps out, sharp and sour, mixing with the damp air. Privacy doesn't exist. If you're lying in bed reading, your neighbour can see the light under the curtain and might comment on it the next morning. If you snore, someone across the room hears it. If you toss and turn, the bed frame squeaks and someone sighs in the dark. Even intimacy isn't private. Couples in communal apartments often had to whisper in the night, moving quietly, hoping the noise didn't carry through the paper-thin walls. Children learned early to pretend they didn't notice. Everyone did. It was just another compromise of space, another unspoken agreement that personal boundaries meant nothing. The walls are scarred with history. Paint peels in layers, each layer a reminder of a different time. Sometimes you can see where furniture used to stand in another family's corner before they moved out or were moved out. The floor creaks under every step. The smell of damp plaster clings to the air, mixed with the smoke from the stove and the constant smell of boiled food. You don't think of it as unusual, it's just what home is. But if you ever stepped into a place outside of this, where rooms were actually separate and doors could close, you'd be struck by the silence, by the space, and it would feel almost alien. At night, the noises of the building never stop. Pipes groan and rattle, carrying water that drips somewhere unseen. Someone stomps down the corridor in heavy boots, the sound echoing through the thin walls. The baby cries again, and a mother shushes it, her voice weary, cracking with exhaustion. Someone mutters in their sleep, words too quiet to make out, but unsettling in the way they spill into the darkness. You try to shut it out, pulling the blanket higher, but the sounds seep in. They always do. The night is never quiet. If you lived in the countryside, your bedroom might look different, but the struggles are the same. A wooden house with a single stove in the main room, everyone sleeping as close to it as possible. The older children on benches, the younger ones tucked in with the parents, all wrapped in the same rough blankets. The stove is the heart of the home, glowing faintly in the dark, the only source of real warmth. But it needs fuel constantly, and someone has to wake in the night to feed it. If the fire goes out, the whole house freezes, and everyone wakes shivering, their breath visible in the dark. There are stories of people in remote villages sleeping fully dressed, boots still on, coats pulled over their clothes, just to make it through the night. The straw mattress beneath them crackles as they shift, the sound loud in the stillness. The blanket on top is more patch than fabric, heavy with years of repairs. Mice scurry in the corners, scratching at the floorboards. Snow creeps in through the cracks in the walls, settling in small drifts that have to be swept away each morning. In the city, you have the noise of neighbours. In the countryside, you have the silence of isolation, broken only by the wind howling outside, pressing against the walls as if trying to break in. So when you think of a bedroom, you can't think of it as a private, comfortable retreat. You have to think of it as just another space, another battlefield in the daily struggle against cold and exhaustion. It's where you sleep, yes, but not where you rest. Rest implies peace. and there's little peace here. There's only the body giving in to fatigue, surrendering for a few hours, and hoping the night passes without too much interruption. The space itself doesn't comfort you. It reminds you of scarcity, of compromise, of everything you don't have. And yet, it's still where you collapse at the end of the day, because there's nowhere else to go. You learn not to expect more. You stop dreaming of bedrooms with doors that close, with beds that cushion your back, with silence that lasts through the night. You accept the scratches of springs against your ribs, the smell of damp wool, the sound of other people breathing around you. You learn to fold yourself into the space, to make do with the corner you've been allotted, to lie down among your belongings and the belongings of others and call it sleep. And as the wind rattles the window again, and the blanket grows heavier with damp, you close your eyes in the not bedroom, hoping for just a little warmth, just a little quiet, before the next day begins. The walls are supposed to separate one family from another, but in reality, they only remind you how close everyone is. They don't muffle anything. They don't protect your privacy. They just stand there, thin and indifferent, letting every cough, every shuffle, every whispered argument drift through. You lie in bed, and the sounds of other people's lives seep into your own. It's not an intrusion anymore. It's simply the condition of living here. At night, when everyone tries to sleep, the apartment becomes a patchwork of noises layered one on top of the other. Someone's snores rise and fall like the tide, rattling through the wall, then fading, then rattling again. A child whimpers in their sleep, calling out for their mother. Someone mutters to themselves, a half-dreaming conversation that makes no sense, but still demands to be heard. A bed creaks rhythmically as someone turns over, then creaks again, then stops. Even silence has a sound here, because the moment it arrives, you wait for the next interruption. Snores are a constant. Deep, rattling snores. Sharp nasal whistles. Stuttering gasps that make you wonder if the person on the other side of the wall is choking. You don't have the luxury of pretending you can't hear them. They're too loud, too close. You learn to live with it, to let the rhythm of someone else's breathing become part of your own night. Sometimes, when there are several men snoring at once, it sounds like an orchestra of broken instruments, each playing its own terrible note, none of them in harmony. You pull the blanket over your head, but the noise doesn't stop. The blanket only muffles your own breathing. Arguments happen at night too. Small quarrels that flare when people are exhausted. Muttered words that grow sharp before softening again. Parents scolding children for staying awake too long. Couples snapping at each other over nothing. Neighbours shouting through thin doors because someone left the stove dirty. The walls don't hide it. You lie there, eyes open in the dark, listening to every word whether you want to or not. The arguments don't belong to you, but they live in your ears just the same. Then there are the smells, which don't care about walls at all. Boiled potatoes, fried fish, cabbage that's been reheated too many times. The scent of kerosene when someone tries to light a lamp. The acrid smoke when the stove spits out soot. All of it drifts through the cracks, blending into a constant fog of other people's meals and other people's fuel. Even in the middle of the night, when no one is cooking, the air is heavy with the residue. It clings to the curtains, to your clothes, to your blanket. You wake up with it in your nose, part of you now. Sometimes you hear the clatter of shoes in the corridor, long after you've gone to bed. Heavy boots trudging past your door, the echo loud enough to make the walls tremble. You never know if it's just a neighbour coming home late or something else. You don't ask, you don't step out. You stay under the covers and hold your breath until the sound fades. Then slowly, you let yourself breathe again, though sleep might not come back for a long time. In the morning, when you wake up from that shallow, fractured sleep, you're already aware of everyone around you. Someone is coughing. Someone else is already boiling water. Children are stamping their feet on the floor. Your own family stirs beside you, tangled under blankets, rubbing their eyes and yawning. Privacy doesn't exist. Not when you're waking up together. Not when you're sleeping separated only by walls that let everything through. If you share a room, the closeness is even sharper. A family of 4 crammed into a space meant for one. Beds pushed against every wall, blankets layered on top of each other, the air thick with the heat of bodies and still somehow freezing. Children pressed against parents for warmth, parents pressed against the wall because there's no space left. Every cough, every sniff, every shift on the mattress is heard by everyone. When one person wakes in the night, everyone wakes. When one person has a bad dream, the whole room suffers. And yet, for all the frustration, for all the exhaustion, there's a strange comfort in the closeness too. You're never alone. Even when you want to be, there's always someone else breathing beside you. Someone else awake in the next room. Someone else living the same cold night. The shared walls don't just bring noise and smells. They also bring reassurance. If you're scared, you're not the only one. If you're cold, someone else is shivering too. If you're lying awake wondering how to survive another winter, you know your neighbours are thinking the same thing. Sometimes the snores even help. The steady rise and fall, irritating at first, can lull you if you let it. It's a reminder that someone else is alive, someone else is sleeping, someone else is enduring. You listen long enough, and your own breathing falls into rhythm with theirs. You drift in and out, never deeply, never peacefully, but at least not alone. The walls creak as the building settles, the sound like a groan in the night. You feel the weight of everyone inside it, every family pressed against every other, each corner claimed, each bed filled. The building breathes around you, sighs with you, snores with you. You're not just sharing walls, you're sharing lives, sharing nights, sharing the same uneasy rest that stretches on until morning. And when the first light of dawn pushes against the frosted window, weak and grey, you know the sounds will shift. Snores will stop, replaced by footsteps, coughing, the clatter of pots. The first arguments of the day, the walls won't keep that out either. They never do. The cold in these buildings doesn't just come from outside. It creeps in through every weakness, every crack, every failed attempt at insulation. You can feel it before you even see it. A faint chill at the back of your neck. A draft sliding across the floor. A steady reminder that no matter how many walls surround you, the winter will always find its way in. You look at the window first, because the window is always guilty. Frost spreads across the glass in thick layers, curling into patterns that would be pretty if they weren't a barrier between you and the outside world. Sometimes the frost forms on the inside too, a thin sheet that crackles when you touch it. The frame doesn't fit anymore, warped by years of damp and neglect. Gaps open up at the edges, and someone has stuffed newspaper into them pressing the pages tight until they yellow and curl. Still, the draft whistles through, lifting the paper slightly with each gust. On particularly bad nights, snowflakes slip inside, melting instantly into tiny drops that run down the wall and freeze again near the floor. Then there's the floor itself, cold enough to make your toes ache even through socks. The boards are old, warped, separated just enough for thin slivers of air to rise from whatever crawl space lies beneath. You feel it when you step out of bed, the chill rushing up through the gaps, reminding you that warmth doesn't last. Some people shove rags into the cracks. Others line the floor with whatever they can find. Old rugs, scraps of cloth, flattened cardboard. Anything to create another barrier, even if it's temporary. The rugs never cover everything. There are always strips of bare woods, always places where the draft sneaks in to bite at your ankles. The walls themselves aren't safe either. They look solid, but when you place your hand against them, the cold seeps straight through. Plaster flakes under your fingers, damp from condensation. In some places, mould grows in the corners, black spots spreading slowly like bruises. You might hang a blanket against the wall to try to block it, but the blanket only grows damp and heavy, sagging under its own weight. The wall behind it stays cold, and the draft continues, slipping around the edges like water around a stone. Doors don't close properly. They never do in these buildings. The wood has swollen, warped, been forced into frames that don't match. Gaps remain at the top, at the bottom, along the sides. You can stuff rags into them, wedge bits of cloth to stop the worst of it, but the draft still slides through. You can feel it in your hair as you pass by, a ghostly brush that makes you shiver even when you're fully dressed. At night, when the rest of the apartment falls quiet, you can hear it too. The faint hiss of air pushing its way through narrow spaces, relentless and patient. The cold doesn't just linger in the air, it takes over objects. The chair you sit on, the table where you eat, the spoon you hold, they're all icy to the touch, stealing heat from your skin as soon as you touch them. You pick up a cup, and it's like holding a lump of frozen metal. You lie down in bed, and the sheets feel like they've been left outside. It takes half an hour for your body to warm them enough to stop shivering. And even then, if you roll into a new spot, the cold greets you again, fresh and sharp. No amount of layering solves it. You wear wool socks, thick shirts, scarves indoors, and still the draft finds your skin. It slides under your sleeves, into the gap at your collar, down your back, over your stomach. You can pull the blanket tighter, tuck it under your body, press it against the mattress, but the air always finds a way in. It doesn't care how careful you are. It doesn't care how desperate you are for warmth. The cold is stronger than you, and you know it. Sometimes you try to fight back. You tape paper over the windows, seal the cracks with putty if you can get some, hang blankets across the doors. For a few days, it seems to work. The room feels a little warmer, a little less hostile. But the cold waits. It presses harder. It pushes against every weak spot until the paper peels, the putty cracks, the blanket shifts. The draft is back, steady and smug, as if it knew all along that your efforts were only temporary. The radiator in the corner is supposed to be your ally, but it's unreliable. On some nights it glows with heat, hissing softly, making the room almost bearable. On other nights it stays silent, a cold metal shell, mocking you with its presence. You put your hand against it, hoping for warmth, and feel nothing. The draft moves in to take its place, circling your legs, climbing up your back, making you curl tighter under the covers. You know the heat will come back eventually, maybe in an hour, maybe in a day, but you can't control it. You never can. You notice the little things more when you're fighting drafts. A candle flickers even though no one has moved. A scrap of paper on the table lifts slightly, then settles again. The curtain shifts without being touched, swaying gently in the invisible current. You learn to see the cold, to track its movements like an enemy in the room. You stuff more newspaper into the cracks. You rearrange the furniture to block the worst of it. You pile heavier blankets on the bed. But no matter what you do, you know it's still there, waiting for you to close your eyes. At night, the drafts grow stronger. Or maybe they just feel stronger when the rest of the world is still. You lie in bed, your nose peeking out from the blanket, and the cold brushes against it until you tuck your face under again. You breathe into the blanket, making a small pocket of warmth, until it grows damp and suffocating, and you have to push your face out again into the draft. Back and forth, warmth and cold, all night long. Sleep comes in fits, never deep, never easy. You wake to adjust the blanket, to turn onto your other side, to press closer to whoever is sleeping next to you. The drafts don't let you forget them. They want you awake. In the morning, the proof is everywhere. Frost crystals on the inside of the window, little piles of snow along the sill, a damp spot where condensation froze and thawed again. Your breath lingers in the air, a faint cloud with every exhale. You step onto the floor, and the cold rushes up into your feet, numbing your toes before you've even taken 2 steps. You shiver before you've spoken a word, before you've eaten a bite. The drafts have already won. The endless cold isn't dramatic. It doesn't come as a sudden blast or a howling storm. It's quieter, more patient, more cruel. It's the steady invasion of air through cracks you can't seal, through walls you can't thicken, through windows you can't repair. It's the feeling that no matter how many layers you wear, no matter how tightly you wrap yourself in blankets, you'll never truly be warm. It's knowing that winter isn't just outside, it's in the room with you, in the bed with you, in your lungs with every breath. And it will stay until it decides to leave. So you stop fighting it. You accept that drafts are part of life, that the cold is always there, always pressing against you. You learn to live with it, to sleep with it, to wake with it. You learn that survival isn't about comfort. It's about endurance. And as you sit by the window, watching your breath fog the glass from the inside, you know the cracks in the wall aren't just letting in the cold, they're letting in the truth. Winter is stronger than you, and it always will be. The only real defense against the cold is what you can pile on top of yourself when the night comes. Quilts, blankets, coats, rags, anything with weight and thickness becomes part of your arsenal. The art of layering is not about comfort. It's about survival. You don't think in terms of softness or breathability. You think in terms of density, of how well a particular blanket blocks the draft that slips under the door, of how many layers you need before your body heat stops escaping into the room. A Soviet blanket was rarely a single uniform piece of bedding. Sometimes it was a family heirloom, handed down from grandparents who got it in better times. A heavy wool quilt patched so many times, the patches were more visible than the original fabric. Other times, it was a military surplus item, coarse, scratchy, the kind of blanket designed to keep soldiers alive in barracks. rather than keep civilians comfortable in their homes. If you were unlucky, it was just a pile of coats stitched together, smelling faintly of sweat and smoke, too heavy to move easily in the night, but not heavy enough to stop you from shivering. Layering wasn't a choice. It was the first step of going to bed. A single blanket meant nothing in the kind of cold that seeped into these rooms. One layer was a mockery. You stacked 3, 4, sometimes 5 if you had them. Thin cotton on the bottom, then wool, then the heaviest quilt you could find, then old coats spread across the top for extra weight. The result was less like sleeping under bedding and more like being pressed under rubble. Your chest rose and fell against resistance. If you needed to turn, you thought twice, because shifting all that fabric felt like moving a wall. But you stayed put, because once the layers were in place, breaking the seal meant letting the cold back in. The weight of the blankets became its own problem. Your body sank under them, pinned in place. Children wriggled at first, kicking at the corners, but eventually learned to lie still because fighting the blankets just made the cold worse. Adults accepted the immobility. You lay on your back or your side, and that was it. Movement wasn't part of sleep. Sleep was about endurance, not rest. The pressure on your chest sometimes made breathing shallow, and yet it was preferable to feeling the draft slip against your skin. Quilts and blankets weren't washed often, because washing them was nearly impossible. They were too large, too heavy, too slow to dry. In the damp winter air, they could hang for weeks without losing their moisture. So they stayed as they were, season after season, carrying the smells of the household in their fibres. Smoke from the stove, cabbage boiled 1 too many times, damp wool, sweat, a faint, lingering odour of mildew. You got used to it, you had to. There was no alternative. Sometimes the blankets froze. Not completely, but at the edges where your breath hit them night after night, leaving small wet patches that stiffened in the cold. You'd wake up with the corners hard, crackling when you moved them. You'd fold them back and see frost inside, delicate crystals that vanished as soon as you touched them. It was a reminder that the cold wasn't outside anymore. It was in your bed with you. Layering wasn't just about blankets. Clothes were part of the system too. You didn't undress to sleep. You added. Socks stayed on, often 2 pairs if you had them. Shirts layered over undershirts. Sweaters pulled over both. Scarves sometimes wrapped around your neck, even in bed. Some people even wore their coats under the blankets, the wool pressing into them as they tried to find a position that didn't hurt. Children went to bed wearing everything they owned, little bundles of fabric barely distinguishable from the bedding itself. Every family developed their own techniques. Some put the heaviest quilt on the bottom, letting the weight settle directly on the mattress, then layered lighter blankets on top so they could breathe. Others stacked everything on top of the sleeper, building a fortress of fabric that had to be peeled away in the morning like the layers of an onion. Some stitched old pieces of cloth together into makeshift quilts, uneven in size, barely holding their shape, but still good enough to add 1 more layer against the cold. Nothing was wasted. Old trousers became patches. Worn coats became covers. Even flour sacks were sewn into blankets, the faded letters still visible on the rough fabric. The art of layering wasn't about aesthetics. Beds didn't look inviting. They looked chaotic, mismatched piles of fabric stacked until they sagged under their own weight. The colours never matched. One blanket was grey wool, Another was green from military stores. Another was faded red cotton printed decades earlier. Together they formed a heap, a mess of weight and necessity. You didn't care what it looked like. You cared only that it kept you alive. And still, despite the effort, despite the careful stacking, the cold found its way in. The edges of the blanket lifted slightly when you shifted, and the draft slid under. Your nose and ears, always exposed, ached with the chill. You curled tighter, pressing your knees against your chest, trying to minimize the surface area left uncovered. You tucked your hands between your thighs for warmth, pulled your feet under your body. The layers pressed harder, your lungs working against them, but you stayed curled anyway. It was the only way to hold on to what little heat you generated. Sleeping with others helped. 2 people under the same pile of blankets made more warmth than one. Families huddled together. Children pressed between parents. Bodies stacked for efficiency. It wasn't comfortable, but it was effective. You could feel the heat from another person seeping into you, and that heat often meant the difference between shivering all night and actually managing to doze off. Couples learned not to spread out in bed. Children fought to sleep in the middle. No one minded being pressed together. In winter, closeness was survival. Sometimes even animals were brought inside to add heat. A cat curled at your feet. A dog pressed against your side, their warmth small but noticeable. In the countryside, chickens sometimes roosted inside near the stove, their faint body heat contributing to the fight against the cold. It wasn't about hygiene. It wasn't about cleanliness. It was about temperature. Everything else could wait. Layering also meant compromise. If one person shifted, the others felt it. If one child kicked the blanket off in the night, everyone shivered until it was pulled back. If someone got up to use the bathroom, the cold rushed in, undoing hours of trapped warmth. Arguments started over who stole more of the blankets, who hogged the heaviest quilts, who left the corner untucked. Families fought in whispers in the dark, irritated by the cold and the lack of space, then fell silent again, too tired to sustain the anger. Morning revealed the cost of layering. Blankets damp with condensation, clothes twisted and wrinkled, hair flattened from being pressed into the pillow all night. The bed smelled of sweat and smoke, heavy with the scent of bodies and damp fabric. You threw back the covers reluctantly, knowing the cold would rush in as soon as the seal was broken. The blanket sagged, heavy with moisture, the edges stiff where frost had formed. You left them as they were, because reassembling them would take too long, and they would never be completely dry anyway. Tonight, you would crawl under them again, the same damp, the same weight, the same unending cold. And yet, despite the misery, despite the heaviness and the dampness, you couldn't sleep without the layers. One night without them, and you would feel naked, exposed, vulnerable to the drafts. The blankets were not just fabric. They were a barrier, a fragile shield against a winter that wanted to take everything from you. You cursed them for their smell, their weight, their dampness, but you depended on them just the same. So every night you returned to them. You layered again, you tucked the corners, you pressed yourself flat under the weight. You let the quilts and coats and rags pin you in place, and you accepted the immobility, the dampness, the shallow breaths. You closed your eyes and waited for sleep to come, hoping the layers would hold until morning. And if they didn't, if the draft slipped through, If the cold settled into your bones again, you would simply endure it, because there was no other choice. You don't change into special clothes for sleep. There is no soft cotton pyjama set folded neatly at the edge of the bed. No ritual of slipping into something fresh and clean at night. The clothes you sleep in are the same clothes you wear all day, the same ones you've worn all week, sometimes all month. They're stiff with use, scratchy against your skin, carrying the smell of smoke and sweat and food that never washes out. But they are warm, or at least warmer than anything else you own, and that is the only quality that matters. Washing clothes in a Soviet winter is not something you do casually. It's a battle, one you prepare for and dread. Water must be hauled, boiled, carried in heavy buckets that freeze around the edges if you're too slow. Soap is rationed, thin and grey, dissolving too quickly, never enough to make clothes truly clean. Then there's drying, which in the cold becomes an ordeal all its own. You can hang clothes inside, draped over chairs or lines strung across the room, but they dry slowly, dripping condensation onto the floor, leaving the air heavy and damp. Sometimes they freeze before they dry, stiff boards of fabric that have to be bent and cracked into shape again. No one wants to go through this often, and so clothes are worn until they simply can't be worn anymore. The wool shirt you pull over your head before bed smells like last week's cabbage because it absorbed the kitchen air while you stood in line for your turn at the stove. The sweater layered on top of it carries a faint sourness from sweat that never got washed out completely. Your socks are stiff with old moisture, the fibres flattened, the heels thin, the toes patched with bits of thread that rub uncomfortably against your skin. You lie down in them anyway, because taking them off would mean waking in the night with frozen feet. In summer, maybe you could risk lighter clothes, fewer layers, even bare feet under the blanket. But in winter, undressing to sleep is unthinkable. Every layer of fabric is another barrier against the cold. You sleep in trousers, in sweaters, in coats if you have to. Children go to bed in everything they own, their tiny arms and legs swallowed in oversized clothes, their heads wrapped in scarves. Parents tuck them in that way, knowing that taking any layer off would only mean more shivering in the night. The fabric rubs against your skin as you shift under the blankets, rough and irritating. Wool itches, cotton stiffens, seams dig into your shoulders. But you learn not to care. Comfort is not part of the calculation. Warmth is all that matters, and warmth is never complete anyway. You wake up scratching at your skin, irritated by the constant rub of unwashed clothes, but you don't change them. You can't. You put them back on in the morning, and you wear them until they fall apart. Some people keep a sleeping shirt, an old stretched piece of clothing worn only at night, its fabric thinner and softer from years of use. But even that isn't washed often. It's too much work, too much water, too much soap. So it smells like the blankets, like the bed, like the room itself. A mixture of smoke and damp and bodies packed too close together. It clings to you as you sleep, damp with condensation from your own breath, heavy with the weight of months without washing. Clothes in winter are rarely individual. Families share what they have, passing down shirts and sweaters from one person to the next. A child outgrows a sweater, and it becomes the mother's sleeping shirt. A father's coat grows too thin, and it's cut into pieces to patch trousers, or to make a blanket for the children. Nothing is discarded. Every thread is needed, which means that the clothes you wear to bed have lived many lives already. They've carried other bodies, other winters, other layers of sweat and smoke. They are never just yours. The smell becomes part of the air itself, a sour, earthy scent that settles into everything, absorbed by the walls, the blankets, the pillows. You don't notice it after a while, not until someone new enters the room. Then it hits you, the weight of fabric that hasn't been washed in weeks, the damp heaviness of clothes that never truly dry. But you can't change it, you can't fix it, you simply accept it, like you accept the drafts, like you accept the weight of blankets, like you accept that winter itself is stronger than you. At night, as you curl under the pile of bedding, your clothes bunch at the elbows, twist at the waist, pull tight across your chest. You tug at them in your sleep, half awake, adjusting, scratching, shifting. The seams leave red marks on your skin. The wool leaves you itchy, raw in places where the fabric rubs against you constantly. Children scratch themselves in their sleep until they bleed, their nails leaving marks on pale skin. But parents only sigh and tell them not to complain. It's better to itch than to freeze. If you lived in the countryside, the situation was worse. Clothes were often homemade, stitched from coarse fabric, heavy and uneven. Shirts cut from old flour sacks, trousers patched with whatever fabric scraps were available, sweaters hand-knit but already unravelling in places. Washing them meant breaking ice on a river, scrubbing until your fingers ached, then hanging them by the stove to dry, filling the house with the smell of wet wool and smoke. Most people simply didn't bother often. They wore their clothes until they reeked, then wore them longer still. The sight of a bed at night is a pile of bodies and fabric, indistinguishable from one another. Clothes blend into blankets, coats blend into quilts, everything pressed together in one heavy mass. You wake in the night, confused, not sure where your clothes end and the bedding begins. Everything smells the same, feels the same, heavy and damp. You pull at your collar, trying to loosen it, but it clings to you. You kick at your socks, but they won't come off. You give up, sink back into the pile, and drift again into shallow sleep. Even when spring comes, the clothes don't change much. The nights are still cold, the air still damp, the draft still creeping through the walls. You might take off one sweater, one scarf, but the rest stays. The smell of unwashed fabric lingers into the warmer months, woven into the fibres so deeply it can't be washed out even when you finally try. You live with it. You sleep with it. You carry it with you always. So when you think of sleep in these winters, you don't think of slipping into clean sheets and fresh pyjamas. You think of crawling under blankets in the same clothes you wore all day, pulling the fabric tight around your body, scratching at the seams, breathing into wool that smells of smoke and sweat. You think of waking up in the morning with your clothes twisted and damp, putting them back on, and wearing them until the night comes again. There is no separation between day and night, between public and private, between waking and sleeping. There are only the same clothes, the same blankets, the same struggle against the cold. And when you close your eyes, your last thought isn't about comfort. It's about whether the layers you're wearing will be enough to hold the heat in until morning. The place where you lay your head at night isn't really a bed the way you imagine it now. It's not a sturdy frame with a mattress designed for comfort. It's not something you bought in a store, picked out because it felt just right. In these winters, in this country, a bed is whatever survived the years before, whatever wasn't destroyed in the war, whatever wasn't stolen, broken, or burned. It's an object of improvisation, more relic than piece of furniture, something that barely functions, but still has to serve as the foundation of every night. Metal frames are common, relics of the pre-war years, their paint peeling in flakes that scatter onto the floor. The springs sag in the middle, squeaking with every shift, so loud they wake not only you, but the people on the other side of the wall. The mattress on top of it isn't a real mattress, not the thick cushion you might expect. It's a thin, lumpy pad stuffed with horsehair if you're lucky, with straw if you're not, with clumps of cotton that flattened decades ago and never bounced back. Sometimes the stuffing has shifted so badly that one half of the mattress bulges while the other dips into a hollow, forcing you into awkward positions that twist your back. You lie down on it and feel the springs poke into your ribs, sharp as fingers pressing through the fabric. Every movement is punished with another squeak, another jab, another reminder that the bed is not on your side. Some people don't even have mattresses anymore. They sleep on couches that have been repurposed, the cushions sagging, the frame broken. Others sleep on benches, narrow wooden planks with a thin blanket folded across them to make the hardness bearable. Children often sleep on pallets laid on the floor, a pile of blankets or coats arranged into something that resembles bedding. In the countryside, straw mattresses are still used, stuffed and restuffed each season, the straw crackling and shifting under your body whenever you turn. The smell of it fills the room, earthy and musty, the scent of barns and livestock following you even into your sleep. Beds are patched and repaired endlessly. A broken spring is tied with rope. A sagging frame is propped up with bricks or stacked pieces of wood. A torn mattress is stitched shut with whatever thread can be found, the stuffing leaking out around the seams anyway. There's no thought of replacing them. Replacements don't exist. Furniture stores aren't filled with options. What you have is what you keep, what you inherit, what you manage to salvage. And so beds remain for decades, passed down from parents to children, their flaws becoming part of the household, their discomforts accepted as normal. The bedding itself is just as improvised. A sheet might be nothing more than an old piece of cloth, too thin to be warm, stained from years of use. Pillows are stuffed with rags, lumpy and uneven, offering little support. Sometimes a rolled-up coat serves as a pillow instead, the rough fabric pressing into your cheek. Blankets are layered on top, mismatched, patched, heavy. The bed looks less like a place to rest and more like a pile of salvaged fabric, a monument to scarcity, a reminder of everything that's been lost. During the war, many beds disappeared. Wood was burned for fuel, frames were dismantled, apartments were looted, belongings scattered. Families forced to flee, with only what they could carry. Afterward, people rebuilt their homes from scraps. A neighbour's broken frame became your bed. A discarded mattress, no matter how filthy, was still something worth dragging home. Beds became collections of parts, no two alike, assembled out of desperation. The result was never elegant. It was functional, barely, and that was enough. The creaks and groans of these beds became part of the night. Every time someone shifted, the sound echoed through the thin walls, reminding everyone of how fragile the furniture really was. Children whispered jokes about the squeaks. Parents shushed them. Neighbours banged on walls when the noise got too much. But no one was surprised. Beds weren't meant to be quiet anymore. They were meant to hold together long enough to get through another winter. And yet, for all their flaws, these beds carried meaning. They were the places where families huddled together, where warmth was shared, where survival was negotiated night after night. The metal frame inherited from a grandmother, the straw mattress sewn by a mother's hands, the patched blanket passed down from an uncle. These weren't luxuries, but they were connections. Each object had history. Each floor told a story. Each piece was proof that something had endured when so much else hadn't. Sleeping in these beds was not restful. You woke with aches in your back, with red lines across your skin where the springs pressed into you. You woke with straw sticking to your clothes, with dust clinging to your hair. You woke coughing from the damp, sneezing from the mould that crept into the stuffing. But you woke, and that was enough. The bed had done its job, imperfect as it was. Sometimes people joked about the state of their beds, laughed about how the springs threatened to stab them, how the straw poked through the fabric. But the laughter was thin, because everyone knew there was no alternative. You made peace with the discomfort. You stopped expecting better. The bed was not a place of luxury. It was simply a surface to collapse on at the end of a long day. A surface that might hurt you, but would still hold you through the night. Children played on these beds during the day, bouncing on the sagging springs, climbing under the blankets, turning the creaks into a game. Adults frowned, worried the frame wouldn't last another winter under the strain. But there was no stopping them. The bed was the heart of the home, not because it was comfortable, but because it was where the family gathered. It was where warmth was pooled, where stories were told in whispers before sleep, where bodies pressed together against the cold. So when you think of these beds, you can't picture something neat or soft or inviting. You have to picture something uneven, patched, uncomfortable, heavy with history. You have to picture a frame that squeaks, a mattress that sags, a blanket that smells of smoke. You have to picture survival stitched together from scraps. A bed built not for rest, but for endurance. And yet, despite everything, when the night came and the cold pressed in from every crack in the wall, you climbed into it anyway. You let the lumpy mattress take your weight. You pulled the patched blankets over you. You pressed yourself against the people beside you. You ignored the creaks, the drafts, the smells. You closed your eyes and you told yourself it was enough. Because in these winters, in this world, the bed was not what it should have been. It was what it had to be. Heat was supposed to come from the system. That's what the government promised, what the engineers designed, what the concrete towers were built around. Central heating, a modern marvel, pipes stretching through every building, radiators bolted under every window. It looked good on paper. It even worked sometimes. But not in the way you imagined. Not in the way that made life warm or easy. Heating was never reliable, never consistent, never truly yours. You could go to bed one night with the radiator glowing red hot, too hot to touch, hissing loudly as steam rushed through it. The room would feel stifling at first, the blankets unbearable, sweat beading on your forehead. You'd peel off a sweater, push down the quilt, finally stretch out for once. But then without warning, it would shut off. The pipes would go silent. The metal would cool. Within an hour, the heat was gone, and the same sweat that had annoyed you now turned icy against your skin. You scrambled for the blankets, pulled every layer back on, cursed under your breath. You never knew when the heat would last, and when it would vanish. When the system worked, it didn't work evenly. Some apartments sweltered, their radiators pumping out heat like furnaces, while others froze, their pipes rattling with nothing inside. Neighbours argued over it, banging on walls, accusing each other of tampering. People in overheated flats opened windows in the dead of winter, letting out precious warmth that others would have begged for. People in cold flats wrapped themselves in coats and sat pressed against radiators that never warmed. The system didn't care. It was designed for uniformity, but uniformity never arrived. In communal apartments, the radiator was a source of tension. Families fought over who could hang their laundry near it, who could sit closest to it, who had the right to claim the small circle of warmth it created. Children pressed their hands against it until their skin turned red, reluctant to move even when scolded. Adults tried to cook small things on it, balancing pots on the hot surface, the smell of cabbage or potatoes mingling with the scent of scorched metal. Everyone knew the radiator wasn't just a heater, it was a battlefield. If the central system failed, and it often did, you relied on stoves. Blackened metal boxes shoved into corners, fed with coal if you had it, with wood if you didn't, with anything that would burn if you were desperate. Furniture disappeared in bad winters. Chairs hacked apart. Broken drawers fed into the fire. People scoured forests for branches, risked fines for taking wood that wasn't theirs, carried back bundles of twigs like treasure. The smoke filled the room, the air sharp and acrid, coating the walls in soot. The stove glowed faintly in the dark, a small red eye holding back the cold, but only barely. You fed it constantly, rising in the night to add fuel, because if the fire went out, the room froze again. In rural houses, the great brick stove was the heart of the home. Families slept near it, some directly on it, the surface warm enough to keep children alive through the night. But even those stoves needed wood, and wood was always scarce. Children were sent to gather sticks. Adults carried axes into the forest, everyone contributing to the pile that stood against the wall. The pile grew smaller each week. Each log burned faster than it should have. Each ember another reminder that winter always consumed more than you could store. Heating was political too. Complaining about the lack of warmth wasn't just complaining, it was dangerous. The system was supposed to be perfect, a triumph of Soviet planning. To say otherwise was to criticize the state, and so you didn't. You grumbled in private, wrapped yourself in another blanket, muttered curses under your breath. Publicly, you shrugged, said it was fine, said it was just how things were. Everyone knew, but no one said it out loud. You learned tricks to make the most of what you had. You taped cardboard to the back of radiators to push heat into the room instead of into the wall. You stuffed rags into cracks, lined windows with layers of paper, draped blankets over doors. You put bottles of boiling water under the covers before bed, hoping they stayed warm long enough to help you fall asleep. You huddled in one room, abandoning the rest of the apartment to the cold, bodies packed together in a single space because spreading out was impossible. Even when the heating worked, it came with costs. Pipes burst under pressure, flooding rooms with scalding water. Radiators cracked, leaking steam that hissed into the air. People were burned badly, children most of all. Their hands blistered from touching surfaces that had suddenly grown too hot. The system gave with one hand and took with the other. Warmth was never safe, never steady. and so every winter was a gamble. Would the heat come tonight? Would the pipes rattle awake? Or would they stay silent? Would the stove burn through the night? Or would the embers die while you slept? You lay under your blankets, listening for the hiss of steam, the groan of pipes, the faint click of metal expanding with warmth. Sometimes the sounds came, sometimes they didn't. When they didn't, you pulled the covers tighter, curled smaller, pressed closer to whoever lay beside you, and endured the endless cold. The irony was that even in summer, the heating system could roar to life. Pipes clanged, radiators hissed, steam filled rooms when no one wanted it. People opened windows, complained about the stifling air, cursed the timing. The system never served you. It served itself, and you adapted. That was the rule. Always adapt. And so the memory of winter nights in the Soviet Union isn't just the weight of blankets or the itch of wool. It's the constant question of heating, the unpredictability of it, the dependence on something you couldn't control. It's the sound of a radiator staying silent when you needed it most. It's the sight of smoke curling from a stove, fed with the last piece of furniture you could spare. It's the feeling of lying awake in the dark, waiting for the pipes to come alive, praying for a warmth that might not arrive until morning. The central heating system was never just a utility. It was a gamble, one you played every night without a choice. You could never be sure what you would get when the pipes came alive, or if they would come alive at all. It was like rolling dice in a game where the stakes were your comfort, your health, and sometimes even your life. People called it many things: unreliable, inconsistent, infuriating, but everyone understood the truth. It was a lottery. You lay in bed listening for it. The first sign was a groan somewhere deep in the walls, a distant rattle that spread like a chain reaction from one end of the building to the other. Then the pipes began to knock, as if someone was hammering inside them. If you were lucky, the radiator would follow, heating slowly, its surface growing warmer, the metal clicking softly as it expanded. Warmth would seep into the room, spreading unevenly, patchy at first, then stronger. You pulled the blankets down, cautiously, testing the air with your hand, wondering how long it would last. But not every night brought that sound. Sometimes the pipes stayed silent, the radiators cold, the building as lifeless as the streets outside. You would wait for hours, hoping the heat would arrive, but it never did. You would wake up in the morning to frost on the inside of the window, to blankets damp with your own breath, to fingers stiff and aching. You cursed the silence, but you cursed it quietly under your breath, because to complain too loudly was to admit the system had failed, and failure was not supposed to exist. Even when the heating worked, it rarely worked fairly. One apartment might swelter, the radiators glowing, the air stifling. The next apartment over might still be freezing, its pipes barely warm to the touch. People joked that you could tell you're standing in society by the temperature of your radiator, but the jokes were bitter. If your flat stayed cold while others were warm, you felt it as a personal punishment, even if it was just bad luck in the labyrinth of pipes. This inequality bred resentment. Neighbours compared notes, asked each other how warm their flats were, accused each other of hoarding heat. People in overheated apartments opened their windows wide, letting out steam into the night, while others sat wrapped in coats or watching their breath fog in the air. It was infuriating to see. You longed to knock on their door, to ask if you could sit in their room just for a little while, to warm your hands by their radiator. But you didn't. You stayed in your own cold flat, your anger building silently, shared only in mutters with your family. The state insisted the system was efficient, scientific, designed for equality. The reality was far from it. Pipes froze, valves broke, entire blocks were left without heat for days. Repair crews came slowly, if at all, bundled in thick coats, carrying tools that looked too small for the job. They chipped at ice, banged on pipes, muttered to themselves. Sometimes the heat returned. Sometimes it didn't. People learned not to expect miracles. They learned to endure. Endurance meant creativity. You kept jars of hot water near your bed, wrapped them in towels to hold the warmth longer. You cooked late into the night, so the steam from the stove filled the kitchen, then slept there instead of in the bedroom. You burned whatever you could find, scraps of wood, old newspapers, sometimes even books, if desperation pressed hard enough. Children were sent to neighbours to sleep if their room was colder than most, everyone shifting around like pieces on a board, trying to find the warmest square. Some winters were worse than others. In mild years, the heating worked enough to keep people alive, though never comfortable. In brutal years, the system buckled under the strain. Entire cities reported outages. Apartments sat like iceboxes. People slept fully dressed under piles of blankets, their bodies shaking until morning. The weakest suffered most. The elderly, the children, the sick. Stories spread of people freezing in their own homes, found under quilts that had grown stiff with frost. Everyone knew someone who had suffered like that, or knew someone who knew. The lottery did not spare anyone for long. When the heat did come, you never trusted it. You held your hands out to the radiator, feeling the warmth creep into your skin, but in the back of your mind, you wondered when it would stop. You learned not to undress fully, not to trust the heat enough to shed too many layers. You stayed cautious, blankets nearby, ready for the moment the pipes went silent again. Warmth was never a guarantee. It was a temporary gift, snatched away without warning. Children played games with the radiators, pressing their ears against them to listen for the gurgle of water, guessing if the heat was coming back. They drew patterns in the frost on the windows, their breath misting the glass, while their parents whispered about broken pipes and missing coal shipments. Everyone lived in two states at once, cold or waiting to be cold again. The irony was that the system was supposed to represent progress. Before, in the countryside, people huddled by stoves, gathering wood all day, feeding fires all night. Central heating was meant to free people from that burden. But in practice, it left them dependent on something they couldn't control. Something that often failed them when they needed it most. At least with a stove, you knew that if you had fuel, you had warmth. With the central system, you had nothing but hope. Hope and blankets. And so every night in the Soviet winter carried that uncertainty. Would the pipes groan awake, or stay silent? Would the radiators glow or freeze? Would you sweat in the heat, or shiver under the weight of every coat you owned? You never knew until it happened. You lived in suspense, waiting for the outcome, waiting for the next roll of the dice. The lottery never ended. It played out every night, every winter, year after year. Sometimes you won a little warmth. More often you lost, but you kept playing because you had no choice. The only way to stop would be to leave, and there was nowhere else to go. So you lay in bed, blankets piled high, ears straining for the rattle of pipes. Sometimes you heard it and your heart lifted. Sometimes you didn't, and you curled smaller, tucking your feet under your body, your breath dampening the fabric around your face, and you told yourself quietly that maybe tomorrow would be warmer. The end of the day didn't mean the end of activity. The apartment didn't fall silent when the sun went down, because the sun had little to do with the rhythm of life here. Night was its own kind of work, its own routine, a set of small rituals repeated over and over until they became the only way to make sleep possible. You didn't simply collapse into bed. You had to prepare, to negotiate, to arrange the night, so that the hours ahead could be endured. It usually began in the kitchen, because the kitchen was the heart of every communal apartment. A single bulb buzzed overhead, casting a weak yellow light over the crowded counters. Families took turns at the stove, one pot after another boiling with cabbage, potatoes, or whatever scraps were left from the ration line. The smell filled not just the kitchen, but every room in the apartment, drifting under doors, seeping into blankets. You ate quickly, not because you wanted to, but because others were waiting. Then you carried your bowl back to your corner, the taste of thin soup clinging to your mouth, the smell following you long after you'd finished. After eating came the slow ritual of securing the room for the night. Every crack had to be checked. Rags were stuffed tighter into the gaps around windows. Newspapers were pressed flatter against the frames. Doors were lined with whatever fabric you had left. Heavy coats hung like makeshift curtains to block the draft. If the radiator was working, you hovered near it, letting your hands grow warm before retreating to the bed. If it wasn't, you muttered about it, low enough so only your family could hear. Complaining too loudly was dangerous, but quiet curses were allowed. They were part of survival. Laundry sometimes still hung on lines strung across the room, damp shirts and trousers stiffening in the cold air. You brushed against them as you moved, the fabric icy, leaving a wet mark on your sleeve. The smell of damp cloth mixed with the smell of smoke from the stove, creating an air so heavy it felt like you were breathing through a rag. But you didn't notice it anymore. It was just the air of the apartment. Children were washed quickly in basins, water warmed on the stove, poured out sparingly so none was wasted. Their shrieks echoed through the halls as the cold water splashed over them, neighbours shouting for silence through the thin walls. Then they were wrapped in towels, dressed in layers, tucked into their shared bed. Parents whispered to them, not bedtime stories, but reminders to stay under the covers, to keep their socks on, to stop kicking the blankets away. Adults had their own rituals. A cup of weak tea, if you had any left, or a sip of vodka if you didn't. A cigarette smoked by the window, the smoke curling into the night air, the orange glow of the tip the only light. Some wrote letters, hunched over tables, the sound of pens scratching faintly. Others mended clothes, needles flashing in the dim light, fingers pricked and raw. Every stitch was another patch against the cold, another layer added to the armour of survival. The apartment never really darkened, even when the lights went out. There was always a glow somewhere, a candle, a cigarette, the faint red of a stove. Shadows stretched across the walls, moving as neighbours moved, flickering when someone passed by with a lamp. Privacy didn't exist in the day, and it didn't exist at night either. You saw the shapes of others through the curtains, heard their voices, smelled their food, their lives pressed into yours, unavoidable. Conversations at night were quieter, softer, but they were never absent. Families whispered about food, about work, about the price of bread. They worried about relatives far away, about neighbours who had disappeared, about the uncertainty of tomorrow. They spoke cautiously, never too loud, always aware that walls had ears. Children were told to hush when they asked questions. Some things couldn't be spoken, not even in whispers. Silence became another ritual, practiced as carefully as any other. Before bed, everything had to be prepared. Blankets laid out, clothes arranged, coats spread across the top for extra weight. Hot water bottles, if you had them, were filled and slipped under the covers, their heat fading within an hour but worth the effort. Families squeezed together, children in the middle, adults at the edges. Everyone pressed tight to conserve warmth. Shoes were left by the bed, coats within reach, because sometimes you needed to get up in the night to tend the stove, or because sometimes there was a knock on the door you couldn't ignore. The noises of the building shifted as the hours passed. Pipes knocked, footsteps echoed in the stairwell, doors slammed. Someone coughed endlessly, their hacking filling the corridor. Babies cried and were shushed. The smell of smoke thickened as stoves were stoked. You lay under your pile of blankets, eyes open in the dark, listening to all of it, knowing that this was what night sounded like. For some, ritual meant prayer. Quiet, hurried, whispered in the dark. Not the loud, public rituals of religion, but small, private words muttered before closing your eyes. A cross made quickly. A plea for health, for warmth, for another day. It wasn't official, not sanctioned, not encouraged, but it was there, in the dark, part of the rhythm of survival. And then came the long silence before sleep. Not real silence, but the subdued hum of life in close quarters. You curled tighter under the blankets, the layers heavy, your clothes scratching, your breath dampening the fabric around your face. You tried to ignore the itch, the smell, the sounds. You tried to let exhaustion pull you under. The rituals had done their work. You were prepared, not comfortable, never comfortable, but prepared. Night didn't bring peace. It only brought endurance. You closed your eyes, felt the draft brush against your cheek, heard your neighbour snore through the wall, and waited for morning. Food was always part of the night, not because there was enough of it, but because there wasn't. Sleep came easier when your stomach was full, but a full stomach was rare. More often, you went to bed with hunger twisting inside you, the ache dull at first, then sharper as the hours stretched on. Bread and soup became the last taste of the day, and they were never enough. A meal before bed wasn't a feast, it was a scrap. A thin slice of bread cut carefully so it would last, sometimes so thin you could almost see the light through it. The crust was hard, the inside dense, chewy, often stale. You chewed slowly, not for pleasure, but to make it last, to trick your body into thinking it had eaten more than it had. Children were given the bigger pieces, parents breaking theirs in half, pretending they weren't hungry. Everyone knew, but no one said anything. Soup was the other constant, watery and thin, little more than hot liquid with a few pieces of cabbage or potato floating in it. Sometimes it was just hot water, flavoured with whatever had been boiled earlier. The taste faint, the warmth the only thing that mattered. You drank it quickly, hoping the heat would spread through you, dull the hunger, carry you into the night. It didn't. Not really, but it was something. The empty bowls clattered softly on the table. the sound a reminder of how little there had been. The smell of food lingered long after it was gone. Cabbage clung to the air, heavy and sour. Potatoes carried a faint sweetness. Bread left crumbs on the table, on the bed, in your lap. You brushed them away, but they clung to everything. The smell followed you into sleep, not comforting, but frustrating, because it reminded you of what you didn't have. Children cried from hunger, whimpering in their sleep, their bellies hollow. Parents hushed them, stroked their hair, promised there would be more tomorrow. Sometimes there was. Sometimes there wasn't. People learned to live with hunger, to accept it as part of the night. It was as constant as the cold, as unavoidable as the draft. You curled up in bed not just to keep warm, but to press your stomach tight, to make the ache easier to bear. The rituals around food were careful, deliberate. Bread was sliced with precision, the knife moving slowly, each cut measured. Soup was ladled evenly, each portion checked, each spoonful counted. Families argued over fairness, children fighting for the larger share, adults scolding them for greed. But everyone understood. There was never enough. You made do, you rationed, you stretched, and still you went to bed hungry. Sometimes neighbours shared, a piece of bread traded for a potato, a bowl of soup swapped for a cup of sugar. Other times they didn't, hoarding what little they had, suspicious of everyone else. Hunger made people generous and cruel in equal measure. It brought families closer together, and it tore neighbours apart. You never forgot who shared with you in hard times, and you never forgot who didn't. On rare nights, there was something more. A bit of meat, thin and stringy, boiled until it was barely recognisable. A piece of butter spread thin across bread, the taste rich, overwhelming after weeks without it. A spoonful of jam, bright and sweet, making children's eyes widen in disbelief. Those nights were remembered for weeks, retold like stories. Proof that life wasn't always empty bowls and stale bread, but they were rare. Mostly it was bread, soup, and hunger. The hunger shaped your sleep. You lay under the blankets, your stomach growling, the sound loud in the silence. You pressed your hands against it, tried to ignore it, tried to think of something else. But hunger was louder than snoring neighbours, louder than the hiss of the draft, louder than the creak of the bed. It filled your thoughts until exhaustion finally forced you into shallow sleep. You dreamed of food often, loaves of bread stacked high, steaming bowls of soup, plates of meat. You woke with a taste still in your mouth, only to find nothing waiting for you. Hunger made you careful with time. You didn't eat too early in the evening, because then the ache would return before you could sleep. You saved your last slice of bread, your last spoonful of soup, for as late as possible, dragging out the act of eating, hoping it would last until morning. It never really did, but it was better than nothing. You trained yourself to expect less, to accept that sleep would always come with hunger. Some nights you went without anything at all. The bread was gone, the soup pot empty, the shelves bare. You sat at the table staring at the wood, your stomach aching, your hands restless. Children whined, asked for something, anything, but there was nothing to give. Parents lied, told them tomorrow would be better, told them to close their eyes and pretend. Then everyone went to bed with empty bellies, the night longer, colder, harder than usual. And yet you endured it. Because there was no choice. Bread, soup, hunger, these were not exceptions. They were the rule. The night was not about satisfaction. It was about survival. You went to bed hungry, you woke up hungry, and you did it again the next day. It became part of the rhythm, as much a part of the night as pulling up the blankets or listening for the pipes. So when you think of sleep in these winters, you can't separate it from food. The two were bound together, hunger gnawing at you as you tried to rest, breadcrumbs on the table, soup pots scraped clean. You closed your eyes not with a full stomach, not with comfort, but with the dull ache of emptiness inside you, carrying you into another night. At night, the apartment was never truly divided. Whatever boundaries existed in the day dissolved as people lay down to sleep, because walls were too thin, rooms too crowded, and resources too scarce for privacy to survive. You didn't sleep alone? Not really. You slept with your family, with your neighbours pressed against the other side of the wall, with the sound of strangers breathing so close it was as if they were in the same bed. The cold made separation impossible. To fight it, people pressed closer together, layers of blankets and layers of bodies stacked in ways that blurred the lines of ownership and intimacy. For families, sleeping together was a necessity, not a choice. Parents lay at the edges, children piled in the middle, the youngest pressed tight between them. The body heat shared this way was the only real insulation. Children kicked and thrashed, tugged blankets away, complained about elbows in their ribs or feet in their faces, but they never wandered far. Even half asleep, they curled back toward warmth. They knew instinctively that moving away meant freezing. Parents tolerated it because there was no alternative. You didn't scold a child for seeking warmth in a winter like this. You pulled them close, sighed, adjusted the blankets, and hoped everyone could settle again. Beds weren't large, and so sleeping was cramped. 2 adults might share a mattress barely wide enough for one, their shoulders pressed together, their bodies forced into stillness by the weight of blankets on top of them. Add children, and there was no space left at all. Feet overlapped, arms draped awkwardly across torsos, faces pressed into someone else's hair or back. If one person shifted, everyone shifted. A small ripple of movement passed across the bed, the creaks of springs louder than any of them wanted. It wasn't comfortable. It wasn't restful. It was survival. In communal apartments, the intimacy extended beyond family. Curtains divided space, but curtains didn't muffle sound, and they didn't block cold. If your corner was draftier than your neighbour's, you sometimes found yourself spending the night together. Families rearranging themselves so that no one froze completely. A child might be sent to sleep with a neighbour's children because their room was warmer. An elderly woman might be invited into another family's corner for the night because her radiator didn't work. No one thought much about it. It was simply what you did. The night belonged to everyone, and so did the struggle against the cold. Sometimes it meant sleeping with strangers. A cousin from the countryside, a co-worker passing through, a displaced family given a corner until something better appeared. They were folded into the nightly arrangement, handed a share of the blankets, pressed into the crowded bed. There was no ceremony, no formality. You moved over, made space, tolerated the discomfort. People's smells, their snores, their habits, these became part of your night instantly, whether you liked it or not. You adjusted, because there was no alternative. The smell of so many bodies together was thick, inescapable. Damp wool, unwashed clothes, sweat, smoke clinging to hair, the sour tang of cabbage still lingering from dinner. The blankets absorbed it all, pressing it back into your skin as you slept. You breathed it in, night after night, until you stopped noticing it. It wasn't pleasant, but it was familiar. It was the smell of survival. The sounds were just as constant. Snores rattling, whistles of breath through blocked noses, coughs that shook the bed, mutters from half dreams. A baby crying, a mother shushing, the creak of springs, the sigh of blankets shifting. The building itself added to the chorus, pipes groaning, wind whistling through cracks, footsteps echoing in the stairwell. Silence never really came. You learned to sleep in the middle of noise, to let it wash over you until your body gave up and slipped into shallow rest. Arguments broke out in the night. A child pushed too hard, a blanket tugged away, someone elbowed in the ribs. Whispers hissed in the dark. Sharp words exchanged before exhaustion silenced them again. Neighbours snapped at each other through the thin walls, muttering insults when snores grew too loud or when a baby wailed for too long. But the anger never lasted. The cold wore it down. No one had the strength to sustain a quarrel through the night. For children, these nights created memories that lingered long after. The feel of their parents' warmth on either side, the weight of blankets pressing them down, the sound of breathing all around them. Some remembered it as comfort, others as suffocation, but all remembered it as unavoidable. There was no other way. You didn't ask for your own bed. You didn't expect silence or privacy. You learned early that sleep was a communal act, as much about the group as about the individual. In rural areas, the closeness was even greater. Entire families slept on or near the great stove, the only real source of heat. Children stretched out on top of it, their cheeks pink from the warmth. Parents lay on benches nearby, listening to the fire crackle, waking in the night to feed it. Animals sometimes shared the space too. Dogs curled at feet, cats stretched on laps, even chickens roosting near the stove for warmth. The line between family and animal blurred, all of them bound together by the need to survive the cold. Privacy was a luxury no one could afford. Couples shared their moments in whispers under the blankets, pretending the children were asleep, pretending the neighbours couldn't hear. Everyone knew, but no one spoke of it. Discretion was part of the unspoken agreement. You ignored what you heard, because you hoped others would ignore you in turn. The walls, the blankets, the night itself carried secrets, and those secrets were simply part of life. Visitors complicated everything. A cousin arriving unexpectedly meant rearranging the sleeping order, squeezing another body into the bed. A travelling worker staying the night meant giving up a blanket, shifting closer together, tolerating the snores of someone you didn't know well. Hospitality was expected, even when it was uncomfortable. You offered what you had, which was rarely enough, but you offered it anyway. The night grew more crowded, the air heavier, the blankets tighter. You endured it, because refusing wasn't an option. Illness spread easily in these conditions. A cough in one bed became a cough in all. A fever passed from child to parent to neighbour. Blankets soaked with sweat were shared, clothes damp with sickness worn to bed again. There was no way to isolate, no way to separate. You slept beside the sick because you had no choice, hoping your body was strong enough to resist. Sometimes it was, sometimes it wasn't. Despite the discomfort, despite the smells and the sounds and the lack of space, there was a kind of reassurance in it too. You were never alone. Even in the darkest hours, when the cold pressed hardest, you could reach out and feel someone beside you. breathing, moving, alive. Their warmth seeped into you, your warmth into them. It wasn't comfort, not in the way you might imagine it, but it was connection. It was proof that you were enduring together. So sleep in these winters wasn't just a private act. It wasn't about individual rest. It was communal, shared, pressed into the shape of the apartment, the family, the neighbours, the strangers who passed through. You lay down each night, not only with your own fatigue, but with the weight of everyone else's too. Their bodies, their breaths, their hunger, their cold. You shared it all, because there was no way not to. And in the morning, when the blankets were thrown back, when the room filled with coughing and shuffling and the clatter of pots, the night dissolved into day. But the closeness remained. The memory of it clung to you, the smell of it in your clothes, the feel of it in your bones. You carried it with you, because there was no leaving it behind. The night was never quiet. Even when the lights went out, even when the last footsteps faded in the stairwell, even when families stopped whispering to each other, the silence never arrived. What you got instead was a collage of noises, layered and unending, the soundtrack of Soviet nights in winter. Sleep had to fight its way through it. You didn't fall into peace. You drifted into exhaustion, while the sounds of the building continued all around you. The first thing you always heard was the coughing. Every building seemed filled with it, a hacking chorus that never stopped. Tuberculosis, bronchitis, colds that never healed because the damp air and the drafts made every illness permanent. Some coughs were deep and rattling, others high and sharp, children barking into the night until their mothers shushed them. You could map the apartment by the coughs. You knew which neighbour hacked in short bursts, which one coughed until they gagged, which one wheezed afterward like an accordion deflating. Sometimes it was almost reassuring, a sign that everyone was still alive. Other times it was unbearable, the sound drilling into your ears, dragging you awake when you had only just begun to drift. Then there were the snores. They came in waves, heavy and uneven. One neighbour snored like a saw through wood, long rasps that seemed to shake the walls. Another snorted in quick bursts, followed by silence, followed by another burst, as if they were choking. Children whistled faintly through blocked noses, their small bodies producing sounds that somehow carried just as loudly as the adults. You pulled the blanket over your head, but it didn't help. The noise seeped through the fabric, vibrating in your bones. Eventually you stopped noticing, not because it disappeared, but because your brain surrendered. It became part of the night, another rhythm to endure. Pipes had their own voices. They groaned and rattled, expanding and contracting as the heating system decided whether to work. Sometimes water gurgled inside them, bubbling and echoing like laughter. Other times they banged, sudden sharp knocks that made you jump in the dark. Children joked that there were ghosts in the pipes, and sometimes it felt true. The noises came at random, impossible to predict, startling you just as you were falling asleep. A single bang could wake an entire room, blankets rustling as everyone stirred and grumbled, only to settle again when they realised it was just the building reminding them of its presence. The wind was always there too, pressing against the windows, whistling through the cracks. It wasn't a gentle sound. It was sharp. A high-pitched whine that slipped into every gap, carrying the cold with it. Curtains shifted. Newspapers stuffed into frames rustled. The draft made a constant hiss like a quiet snake in the corner. Sometimes the wind grew so strong that it rattled the glass, making you fear it would break. You listened to it and pulled the blankets tighter, knowing it was only a thin layer of fabric that separated you from the storm outside. Footsteps in the stairwell were another constant. Heavy boots clattered up and down, their echoes stretching through the walls. You never knew who they belonged to. Sometimes it was just a neighbour returning late from work, sometimes a drunk stumbling home, sometimes something else. You held your breath when they stopped near your door, listening to the pause, waiting for a knock that might come. Most nights it didn't, but the fear never went away. Every sound in the stairwell carried the weight of suspicion. You couldn't ignore it. You listened because you had to. Doors slammed to, sharp cracks that shook the building. People argued in the hall, their voices muffled, but still clear enough to make out anger. Sometimes laughter followed, loud and careless, fueled by vodka. Other times it was crying, a child wailing as their mother dragged them along, a drunk shouting incoherently before collapsing in a corner. The stairwell was alive all night, its sounds echoing into every apartment whether you wanted them or not. Inside the rooms, the smaller noises filled the spaces between. A chair creaked as someone shifted. A pot clanged softly in the kitchen. Water dripped into a basin, steady and slow, a metronome for the night. The crackle of a stove, the hiss of steam from a kettle, the faint scratch of someone turning in bed and dragging a blanket with them. None of these were loud, but together they made a hum, a background that never stopped. You slept inside it the way you slept inside the cold, not by escaping it, but by adapting to it. Sometimes you heard whispers too, parents murmuring to each other under blankets, their words too low to make out, but their tone unmistakable. A couple arguing in hushed voices, their frustration slipping through the thin walls. Someone praying softly, their words broken and hurried, desperate not to be overheard. The whispers were more intrusive than the loud noises, because they reminded you of everything unspoken, everything dangerous, everything that had to stay hidden even in the dark. In rural houses the soundtrack was different but no less constant. The stove crackled louder, wood popping as it burned, the fire roaring when fed. Dogs barked outside, their voices carried across the snow, answering each other from one yard to another. The wind was stronger there too, howling across open fields, slamming against wooden walls until the whole house seemed to shake. Inside, children shifted on benches, straw mattresses rustled, chickens clucked softly in their roosts. Silence didn't exist there either. The night was filled with the voices of the house, the animals, the weather, all of it pressing in as you tried to sleep. The soundtrack wasn't only noise, it was vibration too. The hum of pipes carrying water, the shudder of the building when someone slammed a door too hard, the creak of floorboards when neighbours moved above you. The entire structure seemed alive, a giant body breathing, groaning, shifting through the night. You were part of it, one of many inside it, your own sounds joining the chorus, whether you liked it or not. Sometimes the noises lulled you. The steady rhythm of snores, the regular drip of water, the soft crackle of the stove. They became a kind of lullaby, not gentle, not peaceful, but familiar. You let them wash over you until exhaustion pulled you under. Other times they tormented you, keeping you awake for hours, each sound sharper than the last, each cough and bang and whistle echoing in your head. You pressed a pillow over your ears, But it didn't help. The building was too alive to be ignored, and so you accepted it, just as you accepted the drafts, the hunger, the weight of the blankets. Noise was part of the night, part of sleep, part of life. You didn't dream of silence, because silence was impossible. You dreamed of food, of warmth, of things you might never have, but never of quiet. Quiet didn't exist. The soundtrack of Soviet nights was unending, and you lived inside it until morning. The idea of getting clean before bed, of slipping between fresh sheets after a warm bath, was a dream that didn't belong here. Bedtime hygiene in the Soviet Union, especially in the deep cold of winter, was not a matter of luxury or comfort. It was a negotiation with scarcity. Water was rationed, soap was scarce, heating unreliable, and privacy almost non-existent. To wash at night required effort, resources, and space that most people didn't have. And so the rituals of hygiene were reduced, pared down to the barest gestures, carried out with bowls, rags, and water that was often more ice than liquid. In communal apartments, the bathroom was shared. One sink, one toilet, sometimes one bathtub for half a dozen families. You waited your turn, knocking on the door, listening to the muffled sounds of your neighbours washing or scrubbing behind it. By the time it was your turn, the basin was often ringed with grime, the water lukewarm at best, the soap reduced to a sliver passed from hand to hand. You didn't linger. You splashed your face, rubbed your hands, maybe rinsed your mouth if you were lucky. Anything more was wasteful, indulgent, impossible. Bathing in a tub was rare, not because people didn't want it, but because heating enough water was a monumental task. You had to boil pot after pot on the stove, carry them to the bathroom, pour them in one by one. By the time the tub was half full, the first water had cooled, steam gone, warmth fading. And in winter, the room itself was too cold to undress comfortably. The air cut into your skin, the floor froze your feet, your breath came out in clouds. A full bath might happen once a week, or once every 2 weeks, if fuel and water and time aligned. More often, it didn't. Instead, people washed with rags, a basin of water set on a chair, a cloth dipped and wrung out, wiped over face, arms, neck. The water stung, icy even when warmed, numbing your fingers as you worked. Soap, when you had it, was harsh, leaving your skin dry and cracked, smelling faintly of chemicals. Most nights there was no soap. You splashed, wiped, dried yourself with a towel that never seemed to get clean, that always smelled faintly of mildew. Children squirmed, crying out when the cold rag touched their skin. Mothers shushing them, hurrying through the task so it would be done. Teeth were brushed sometimes, with powder instead of paste, a chalky substance that left your mouth dry, your gums sore. Brushes were shared, passed from person to person, the bristles worn and splayed. Many skipped it altogether, not out of choice but because the supplies simply weren't there. Bedtime routines that are second nature now, brushing, flossing, rinsing, were luxuries then. You wiped your mouth with a rag, maybe chewed a piece of black bread to scrape your teeth, and called it done. Hair was rarely washed in winter. Water was too cold, drying took too long, and catching a chill was too dangerous. Women brushed theirs before bed, pulling a comb through tangles, collecting loose strands in small piles. Men often let theirs grow greasy, covered by hats during the day, hidden by the dark at night. The smell of unwashed hair filled the room, mingling with the other odours of bodies and blankets, but it was ignored. No one expected otherwise. Clean hair was for spring, for summer, for rare visits to a bathhouse when the opportunity came. The bathhouse was its own ritual, a social event, but it didn't belong to the nightly routine. It was occasional, sporadic, something planned days in advance. At night, in the home, hygiene was reduced to what could be done quickly, quietly, with as little water and effort as possible. You wiped your face, you rinsed your hands, you changed into whatever sleeping clothes you had, often the same clothes you wore all day, and you climbed into bed. The smell of the room told the truth of this routine. Damp, sour, heavy. Sweat clinging to wool, smoke in hair, cabbage on breath. Blankets that hadn't been washed in months, pressing it back into your skin. You lay down in it, turned your face into it, breathed it in all night. It wasn't pleasant, but it was familiar, and familiarity dulled the disgust. After a while you didn't notice it, or you told yourself you didn't. Children asked why they had to wash at all if it was so cold, if the water was so miserable. Parents told them it was necessary, but their own fatigue made them lenient. A quick splash, a dab with a rag, and it was enough. Better to send them to bed a little dirty than to risk them catching a chill from wet skin in an unheated room. Cleanliness mattered, but survival mattered more. The choice was obvious. In the countryside, hygiene was even more stripped down. Water came from wells, carried in buckets heavy with ice around the rims. Washing meant breaking the surface, dipping the bucket, hauling it back to the house, heating it over the stove. The effort was enormous for something that vanished the moment it touched your skin. People conserved it, using the same basin of water for everyone, each person dipping the rag, wiping quickly, passing it on. By the end, the water was cloudy, grey with dirt, but it was still used. There was no waste. In winter, many went to bed without washing at all. It wasn't laziness, it was practicality. The cold air, the lack of fuel, the absence of soap, all made it easier to skip. You told yourself you'd wash in the morning. Sometimes you did, more often you didn't. Dirt accumulated, sweat layered, smells deepened, and yet life went on. Hygiene was not measured by freshness, but by whether you were still strong enough to work, to stand in line, to survive another day. The body adapted to it. Skin toughened, cracked but resilient. Hair grew oily but kept the cold out. Clothes carried the smell of smoke, covering the smell of sweat. You scratched at your skin under the blankets, rubbed at your scalp, wiped your face with the edge of the sheet. Small gestures replaced rituals, enough to make you feel like you had done something, even if nothing really changed. At night, the sounds of hygiene filled the apartment just as much as the sounds of life. The splash of water in basins, the scrape of combs through hair, the coughs that followed when someone swallowed toothpaste powder, the sighs of children protesting. You lay in bed listening, waiting your turn, dreading the cold water on your skin. When it came, you shivered, cursed, dried yourself quickly, and returned to the blankets, your body tingling from the shock. Hygiene was never about feeling fresh or clean. It was about doing just enough to keep going, just enough to keep illness at bay, or at least the illusion of it, just enough to maintain a routine, to pretend that life had order. It was survival disguised as cleanliness, gestures that carried meaning not because they worked, but because they reminded you that you were still human, even in the cold, even in the scarcity. So when you think of bedtime hygiene in these winters, don't picture steaming baths or soft towels. Picture a cold basin, a rag stiff with old water, soap worn to a nub. Picture a mother hurrying her children through a wash before they froze. A father splashing his face in silence, drying it with a towel that smelled of mildew. Picture the air heavy with smoke, sweat, damp wool, the blankets pressing all of it back into the skin that had just been wiped. Picture the nightly acceptance that clean enough was as close to clean as you would ever get, and then picture everyone curling under the covers, unwashed hair on the pillow, unbrushed teeth clenched against hunger, bodies pressed together, the cold seeping in anyway. Hygiene wasn't a matter of comfort. It was a matter of doing what little you could, then surrendering to the night as you were. When sleep finally came, it was rarely peaceful. The body gave in to exhaustion because it had no other choice, but the mind never rested completely. The cold shaped your sleep. The hunger shaped it. The constant noise of neighbours shaped it. And over all of that lay another weight, heavier than blankets, heavier than fatigue, the fear that followed you even into your dreams. Dreams were not gentle things. They carried pieces of the day, distorted and sharpened. You dreamed of bread because you were hungry, dreamed of warmth because you were cold, dreamed of silence because the noise of the building never let you go. In the dream, the bread was endless. Loaves stacked high, soft and steaming, more than you could eat. You tore at it with your hands, swallowed without chewing, only to wake with the taste still in your mouth, and nothing waiting for you but stale crusts or empty shelves. The disappointment lingered longer than the hunger itself. Sometimes you dreamed of summer, of grass under bare feet, of rivers where you swam, of sunlight so hot it made your skin sting. The memory of warmth carried into the dream, a sensation so real you believed in it for a moment. You woke under the weight of blankets, breath fogging the air, your body shivering, and the contrast was cruel. It was better not to dream at all. Better to stay in the dull fog of exhaustion than to be teased by memories your life could not give you any more. Nightmares were more common than dreams. The cold crept into them too, turning your sleep into visions of ice and endless snow. You dreamed of wandering streets in the dark, your feet numb, your breath shallow, doors locked against you, no shelter anywhere. You dreamed of frost spreading across your skin, your fingers stiffening, your body heavy, until you couldn't move anymore. These dreams didn't feel like fiction. They felt like prophecy, as if your mind was warning you of what might really happen one day if the blankets weren't enough, if the heating failed again, if you fell asleep in the wrong corner of the room. And then there were the other nightmares, the ones born not from cold or hunger, but from fear. The fear that never left you, the fear that crept into every whisper, every silence, every knock in the stairwell. You dreamed of boots echoing in the hall, of fists pounding on doors, of voices demanding names. Sometimes you dreamed of neighbours being taken away, their faces blank as they disappeared into the dark. Sometimes you dreamed it was your own door, your own name, your own family dragged into the night. You woke gasping, heart racing, ears straining for real footsteps. You told yourself it was just a dream, but the fear lingered because you knew it wasn't impossible. You had heard the knocks before. You had heard the doors open. You had heard the silence afterward. The line between dream and reality blurred too easily in those nights. A sound in the stairwell slipped into your dream until you couldn't tell if you were awake or asleep. You dreamed of whispers, only to realise they were real, coming from the other side of the wall. You dreamed of crying, only to realise it was the baby next door. Sometimes you dreamed of silence, deep and absolute, only to wake and realise that silence had weight too, that it often came after something terrible had happened. Children had their own nightmares, and they cried out in the night. Parents shushed them quickly, pressing hands over mouths, whispering comfort that was more about quieting them than calming them. Children dreamed of monsters, of wolves, of falling into snowbanks too deep to climb out of. They didn't understand yet that the real monsters wore uniforms, that the real danger didn't come from the forest, but from the knock at the door. Parents never told them. They let them dream of wolves, because wolves were easier. Even adults carried nightmares from the war. Men dreamed of trenches, of bombs, of frozen marches across ruined villages. Women dreamed of hunger so severe they had eaten grass, bark, anything that might fill their stomachs. Some woke screaming, some woke silent, their eyes wide, the hands shaking. They turned over, pulled the blanket tighter, pretended to sleep again. You didn't talk about nightmares in the morning. You didn't ask what someone had dreamed. The rule was silence. Whatever haunted you at night stayed there unspoken. The fear of informants infected the nights as much as the cold. You never knew who might be listening, who might repeat what you said in a whisper, who might twist it into something dangerous. Even in sleep, this paranoia clung to you. You dreamed of neighbours watching you, of walls that grew ears, of words slipping out of your mouth without your permission. You dreamed of yourself betraying someone by accident, your voice carrying secrets you didn't mean to tell. You woke sweating, your mouth dry, your heart pounding, and you said nothing. You never admitted it. Fear wasn't just part of the day. It was part of the night too. Sometimes the fear was real. Sometimes the boots really did echo in the stairwell. Sometimes the knocks really did come. You woke to the sound, your whole body tense, listening for which door it was. If it was yours, there was nothing you could do. If it was your neighbour's, you lay still, silent, pretending to sleep while your heart hammered. You heard the door open, heard the voices, heard the shuffle of feet. Then the silence afterward, heavier than the noise had been. You knew better than to speak of it in the morning. You simply noted the absence, the missing voice, the empty corner. Life went on. The night carried it, and the day buried it. All of this shaped the way you slept. It wasn't deep, wasn't steady. You drifted in and out, half aware, your ears always listening even when your eyes were closed. You woke often, not from comfort, but from vigilance. A cough, a bang, a whisper, a knock. All of it pierced the thin layer of sleep you managed. You lay awake, staring into the dark, waiting for your heart to slow again, waiting for the noises to fade, waiting for exhaustion to drag you under once more. Dreams could betray you too. You learned to be careful with what you said in your sleep. Talking in dreams wasn't uncommon. Exhaustion loosened your tongue. Fear slipped out in half-formed words. A neighbour might hear through the wall. A family member might repeat it in the morning without thinking. People were punished for less. And so, you tried to train yourself, even in sleep, to keep silent. The fear was so deep, it shaped your dreams, made you wary even in the world inside your head. And yet, despite the nightmares, despite the fear, despite the shallow sleep, you still needed it. You still gave in to it, because there was no choice. The body demanded rest, no matter how uneasy. You curled under the blankets, your breath damp against the wall, your ears tuned to every sound. your mind bracing for another dream. Sometimes it was hunger. Sometimes it was wolves. Sometimes it was boots in the stairwell. You didn't know which it would be until it came. You endured it all the same. And in the morning, when the light finally pressed against the frosted window, when the apartment stirred with coughing and clattering, you rose heavy with fatigue, carrying the weight of the night into the day. You didn't speak of what you dreamed. You didn't mention the fear. You simply got dressed, ate what little you had, and prepared for another night to come. Children had no protection from the winter beyond what their parents could improvise. They didn't understand drafts or the failures of central heating, didn't know about the shortages or the rations that dictated what was possible. What they knew was that night was always cold, that their toes ached in bed, that their breath froze against the blankets, and that warmth came only when their small bodies were pressed between the larger ones around them. Childhood in the Soviet winter meant learning early that sleep wasn't comfort. It was endurance, the same as it was for the adults. Babies were wrapped as tightly as possible. Mothers swaddled them in layer after layer of cloth, winding them until only a face peeked out, red from the cold air. Cradles were little more than wooden boxes, lined with rags, stuffed with straw, sometimes padded with bits of old clothing. A blanket was thrown on top, heavy enough to trap what little heat the infant's body produced. Mothers rocked them with one hand, while tending to chores with the other, the sound of the cradle creaking mixing with the groans of pipes and the snores of neighbours. The baby's breath fogged the cloth near its mouth, dampening it until it froze stiff. Parents brushed away the frost in the morning, shook out the rags, and swaddled again the next night. Children who were older shared beds. Often 3 or 4 to a mattress meant for one. They argued over who got to sleep against the wall, because the wall, though cold, blocked at least some of the draught. The unlucky child ended up on the outer edge, feet sticking out, shoulders exposed to the air. Parents scolded them for kicking the blankets off, but children kicked anyway, restless in their sleep, tangling themselves in the heavy fabric until someone yanked it back. Toes were always the first to freeze. Socks were patched and repatched, worn thin, the fabric rubbing holes until heels and toes peeked through. Mothers mended them by the dim light of the kitchen, mutterings that the socks would never last, but still sending the children to bed in them, knowing bare feet meant worse. Some children wore boots to bed, too large for their small legs, clumsy under the covers. It wasn't comfortable, but it was safer than waking in the night, with feet so numb they burned with pain. Others went to sleep with their feet pressed into the stomachs or thighs of their siblings, stealing warmth wherever they could find it. Complaints were constant, but no one really resisted. They all understood that sharing body heat was the only way to keep from crying out in the dark from the ache in their toes. Parents worried constantly. They pulled blankets higher over their children, pressed them closer, checked their faces in the dim light to make sure the cold hadn't stolen too much from them. They told them bedtime stories, not fairy tales, but practical stories about keeping warm, about not throwing off the quilt, about staying still so the blankets wouldn't shift. Children didn't listen half the time, but the words became part of the rhythm of the night, repeated until they sank in. Hunger added to the misery. Children went to bed whining about empty stomachs, rolling restlessly, asking for bread that wasn't there. Parents hushed them with promises of tomorrow, promises they couldn't guarantee. Some children cried themselves to sleep, tears freezing on their cheeks, their little hands clutching the edge of the blanket. Others learned quickly not to complain, to bury their faces against their parents and let exhaustion drag them under. Childhood wasn't shielded from hunger. It was defined by it. Illness spread quickly in these conditions. A child with a fever was kept in the same bed as the others, because there was nowhere else to put them. Blankets soaked with sweat were shared, coughs carried through the room, noses wiped on sleeves that went unwashed. Parents prayed quietly that it would pass, that the child's body would fight through it. Sometimes it did, sometimes it didn't. Small graves filled the countryside in winter, and neighbours whispered about who had lost a son or a daughter that week. The cold wasn't just uncomfortable, it was dangerous. Everyone knew it, especially the parents who watched their children shiver each night. Toys were scarce, but sleep had its own games. Children pretended the blankets were tents, that they were explorers hiding in caves, that the draft was a dragon to be fought off. They whispered to each other in the dark, their voices carrying across the bed until their parents told them to be quiet. Laughter came in bursts, quickly silenced, but it lingered as a small defiance against the cold. Even in the worst conditions, children invented ways to make it bearable. In the countryside, children often slept on the stove itself, the warm brick surface flat and wide enough for 2 or 3 small bodies. Their cheeks turned red from the heat. Their hair smelled of smoke. Their dreams carried them into softer worlds. Parents watched them carefully, making sure they didn't roll off, making sure they didn't burn themselves. The stove was both salvation and danger, but it was better than frostbitten toes. Children curled up on top of it like kittens, sighing softly, the warmth protecting them for one more night. For families without stoves, it was worse. Children slept in corners lined with straw, their bodies covered in whatever scraps could be spared. They huddled together, their feet tucked under each other's legs, their noses buried in each other's necks. They woke with straw clinging to their clothes, with scratches on their skin, with frost on their hair. But they woke, and that was enough. Parents worried about their children's feet most of all. Frostbite was a constant threat. Toes turned red, then white, then blue. The skin cracked, the nails blackened. Children complained of burning pain, then stopped complaining altogether, which was worse. Mothers rubbed their feet at night, massaging warmth back into them, wrapping them in rags heated by the stove. Fathers cursed the lack of boots, the thinness of socks, the uselessness of promises that new shoes would come next month, next year. Every family had stories of children who had lost toes to the cold, who limped through the rest of their lives. Despite all this, childhood carried a strange resilience. Children adapted faster than adults. They played in the snow during the day, their cheeks glowing, their laughter sharp against the frozen air. They came in soaked and shivering, and still they smiled. At night, they fell asleep faster, their bodies surrendering quickly, their minds less haunted by fear. Parents envied that ability. They watched their children's faces soften in sleep, their mouths open, their breath visible in the dark, and felt a small comfort. As long as the children could still sleep, there was hope. But hope was fragile. Every cough in the night made a mother's stomach tighten. Every restless shift reminded a father that the blankets weren't enough. Every whimper from a child's frozen feet echoed louder than the wind outside. Parents lay awake long after their children have fallen asleep, listening, worrying, planning. Sleep for them came late, shallow, haunted. The children dreamed of warmth. The parents dreamed of survival. Morning revealed the damage. Children woke with red noses, with hands chapped and raw, with toes aching. They whined as they were pulled from under the blankets, shivering as their feet touched the icy floor. Parents scolded them gently, urged them to dress quickly, to move, to eat. But the parents felt the same ache, the same stiffness, the same fatigue. Childhood offered no immunity. The cold claimed everyone equally. So the memory of children in these winters is not of carefree sleep, not of cradles lined with soft cloth or of beds warmed with hot water bottles. It is of swaddled infants breathing against frozen fabric, of siblings piled together under patched blankets, of small feet pressed into larger bodies in the desperate search for warmth. It is of cold toes, always cold, no matter how many socks or rags were wrapped around them. It is of childhood defined not by comfort, but by the lessons of endurance taught every night. And those lessons lasted. The children grew, remembering the nights of swaddling, the arguments over who got the wool, the mornings of aching toes. They carried it with them into adulthood, into their own families, into their own winters. Sleep, for them, was never simple again. It was always tied to the cold, to the fear, to the endless fight for warmth that had shaped their earliest memories. The way you slept in the Soviet winter depended heavily on where you lived. The countryside and the cities were two different worlds, each with its own burdens, its own fragile comforts, its own rhythms of night. On the surface, people in both places fought the same enemy, the cold that pressed into every crack and stole warmth from every bed. But the weapons they had to fight it with were not the same. The contrast was sharp, and yet, at its core, both sides endured the same thing: sleep that was never really rest. In the cities, sleep was dominated by the communal apartment. Whole families stacked inside rooms that had once belonged to a single household, divided by partitions, curtains, and sheer necessity. Beds were patched together from scraps, blankets layered as high as possible, radiators prayed over like fickle gods. You slept to the soundtrack of coughing neighbours, banging pipes, boots in the stairwell. The walls were thin, privacy non-existent, and the air heavy with smells that never left: boiled cabbage, damp wool, kerosene smoke. Even in your own bed, you were never alone. The city gave you proximity, but not comfort. The central heating system was a lottery, sometimes boiling hot, sometimes cold as stone. When it worked, the room stifled, radiators hissing so loudly that sleep came with sweat trickling down your back. When it failed, you curled under every coat you owned, your breath frosting in the air. You could not control it. The city decided for you. You were dependent on pipes, on crews that might not come, on a system too large to care about individual suffering. But the city had advantages. Water was closer, even if it was cold and rationed. Soap could sometimes be found if you queued long enough. A bathhouse, though rare, was at least within reach. Neighbours could be infuriating, their snores and whispers carrying through the walls, but they were there, and in the darkest nights you felt less alone. The density of people, the layers of bodies, the shared blankets, all of it built a fragile warmth. Fragile but real. The countryside was different. Nights there were quieter, but no less harsh. You slept in wooden houses, not concrete towers, and the cold, seeped in differently. The wind howled across open fields, pressed against walls, rattled shutters, whistled through gaps in the logs. The stove was your salvation, a massive brick structure that dominated the house, glowing faintly in the dark. Families slept around it, on benches nearby, on top of it when space allowed. Its heat was direct, reliable, but it came at a cost. Constant labour. Wood had to be chopped, stacked, fed into the fire without pause. Someone always rose in the night to add fuel, stumbling from bed half asleep, hands stiff, smoke stinging their eyes. If the fire went out, the room froze in hours. The countryside gave you control over your warmth, but it demanded work. Children carried branches, men hauled logs, women stoked flames, ashes were swept, embers coaxed, smoke vented through chimneys that often clogged with soot. The smell of wood smoke clung to everything, your hair, your blankets, your skin. You coughed in your sleep, eyes watering, but you forgave it because it meant the stove was working. Without it, there was nothing between you and the cold. Beds in the countryside were often straw mattresses, lumpy and noisy, stuffed each season with fresh hay or whatever could be gathered. The smell of earth followed you into sleep, the crackle of straw loud when you shifted. Children scratched themselves raw, straw poking through the fabric, but they slept anyway, exhausted from the day's chores. Blankets were patched from old clothes, coats laid over them for weight. Families huddled together, not just because of the cold, but because the stove made the central room the only warm place. Bedrooms, if the house had them, were often abandoned in winter. Everyone slept in one space, the air thick with breath, the floor littered with boots and tools, the stove glowing at the centre like a tired guardian. The countryside had silence the city never did. No neighbours through the wall, no banging pipes, no stairwell boots. But silence wasn't comfort either. Silence made the wind louder, the wolves in the distance sharper, the creaks of the wooden house more ominous. You heard every gust, every branch scratching against the window, every bark of a dog. You lay awake listening, wondering if the roof would hold against the storm, if the woodpile would last until spring. In the silence, fear found more space to grow. City nights meant the fear of informants, the fear of knocks at the door, the fear of vanishing neighbours. In the countryside, the fear was different. It was the fear of distance, of isolation, of illness with no doctor nearby, of hunger with no market to turn to. A sick child in the countryside had only the stove, a few herbs, a parent's prayers. You listened to their cough in the night, the silence of the surrounding fields pressing in, and felt the weight of being so far from anyone who could help. The city was oppressive, the countryside lonely. Both fears found their way into the night. Food shaped the nights too. In the city, you ate what rations allowed, lined up in queues for bread that ran out before your turn. Boiled cabbage in tiny kitchens shared with half a dozen families. In the countryside, you had potatoes from the cellar, jars of pickled vegetables, sometimes meat if you were lucky enough to have livestock. The food was different, but the hunger was the same. Children in both places went to bed whining. Mothers in both places hushed them. Fathers in both places felt the same dull anger at their own helplessness. The countryside gave you a cellar of potatoes instead of a bread card, but it didn't make the nights any less hollow. And yet, in small ways, the countryside gave more warmth of a different kind. Families were larger, closer, tied not just by necessity but by tradition. Grandparents slept in the same room as children, their snores mingling, their hands reaching out in the dark to soothe nightmares. Animals shared the house too. Dogs curled at feet, cats stretched on benches, sometimes even chickens roosting inside for warmth. The line between human and animal blurred, everyone fighting the same cold. The city was crowded but impersonal. The countryside was intimate, suffocating in its closeness, but at least it was family. Morning looked different too. In the city, you woke to the sound of pipes groaning, doors slamming, neighbours coughing, pots clattering in the shared kitchen. In the countryside, you woke to silence broken only by the creak of the stove door, the crack of wood splitting, the muffled sound of snow sliding from the roof. But both mornings brought the same reality. The blankets pulled back, the cold rushing in, the shiver that ran through your body before you even stood up. Both mornings demanded the same endurance, the same acceptance that winter was not leaving anytime soon. So the contrast between countryside and city was sharp, but the end was the same. Sleep was never soft, never easy, never secure. In the city, it was stolen by neighbours and pipes and fear. In the countryside, it was stolen by silence, by distance, by the endless work of keeping the stove alive. You might envy the other side from time to time. City dwellers dreaming of warm stoves, villagers dreaming of central heating. But the truth was that neither place gave what you really wanted. Neither gave rest. Both gave nights heavy with cold, mornings heavy with fatigue, lives shaped by endurance. And so when you imagine the Soviet winter night, you cannot separate city from countryside. You must see both. The concrete towers echoing with snores and coughs, the wooden houses glowing faintly from their stoves. Different shapes, different sounds, but the same struggle. You must picture blankets piled high, children curled in tight bundles, parents lying awake listening for danger. You must picture the same fog of breath in the air, whether it drifted through a city stairwell or a village hut. The same cold toes, the same hunger, the same restless dreams. Two different worlds, united by the same winter. The harshness of Soviet winters was terrible in the cities and in the countryside, but in the Gulag it became something else entirely. There, the cold was not an inconvenience or even just a hardship. It was a weapon. It was part of the system, woven into the punishment, into the very design of camp life. To sleep in the Gulag during winter was not to rest. It was to survive another few hours if you could. It was to hold on until the whistle blew again at dawn, pulling you back into labour that would wring out the last strength your body had left. Nights in the Gulag were not breaks from suffering. They were extensions of it. The barracks were long wooden buildings, crude and hastily built, with walls that never fit together properly. Cracks gaped between the boards, the wind sliding through them as if the walls weren't there at all. Snow blew inside when the storms were strong enough, drifting onto the floor, dusting the bunks with white. The roofs sagged, patched with tar paper and planks, leaking when snow melted, freezing again when it turned to ice. Inside, it was not much warmer than outside. Sometimes it was colder, the dampness trapped, the air heavy and still. You stepped in and felt the cold close around you like a hand. The bunks were stacked in tiers, rough planks nailed together. Mattresses were rare, and when they existed they were filled with straw that quickly grew damp, mouldy, crawling with lice. Most slept directly on the boards, their bodies pressing into the splinters, their bones aching against the hardness. Blankets were almost never enough. Thin, coarse wool, often shared between 2 or 3 prisoners, patched and torn, heavy with dirt. Men and women slept in coats if they still had them, their breath frosting in the air, their skin sticking to the boards where sweat had frozen during the night. Prisoners packed together as tightly as possible. 2 to a bunk, 3 if they could fit. Bodies tangled not out of choice, but because it was the only way to keep from freezing. Strangers pressed together, their warmth shared, their breath mingling, their lice crawling from one body to the next. The stench was suffocating. Sweat that never dried, clothes never washed, boots caked with mud and snow, open sores covered by rags. The smell of sickness, of hunger, of rot filled the air, stronger than the smoke from the small stove at the centre of the barrack. The stove was supposed to heat the room, but it rarely did. Fuel was scarce. Wood or coal rationed tightly, often stolen by guards or burned in their own quarters. Prisoners fed it with scraps of whatever they could find, bits of broken wood, sometimes their own belongings when desperation pressed too hard. The stove glowed faintly, casting weak light in the dark, but the warmth never reached the far ends of the barrack. Those closest to it sweated while those near the walls froze. Men fought for space near the stove, fights that sometimes ended in blood. The guards didn't care. A dead prisoner was just one less mouth to feed. The cold seeped into the body in ways that never left. Toes blackened, fingers stiffened, noses split and bled. Frostbite was constant. Infection spread unchecked. Bandages were rags torn from shirts. Men lost fingers, ears, whole feet. Women huddled under blankets, their hair stiff with frost, their lips blue, their hands trembling as they tried to keep their children alive through the night. Some gave up, lying down on the boards and refusing to move again, their bodies stiffening slowly until the others pulled them out in the morning. Sleep came in fragments, shallow and restless. Coughs echoed through the barrack, hacking and wet, punctuated by groans of pain, mutters of delirium. People spoke in their sleep, calling for mothers long dead, for children they hadn't seen in years, for bread that never arrived. Some thrashed, some cried out, some went silent in the night and never stirred again. You lay awake listening to all of it, knowing that each sound might be the last that person ever made. Hunger shaped the nights as much as the cold. Stomachs growled so loudly they seemed to fill the room. Men dreamed of bread, woke biting into air. Women dreamed of soup, woke licking their cracked lips. The weak gnawed on bits of leather, on scraps of wood, anything to distract from the emptiness. Sometimes the smell of food drifted from the guards' quarters, rich and heavy, a cruelty in itself. Prisoners inhaled it through the cracks, their mouths watering, their bodies aching with envy. Then they turned back to their bunks, curled smaller, and tried to forget. Illness spread like fire. Tuberculosis, typhus, dysentery. The barracks were perfect breeding grounds. A single cough could infect dozens. Blankets were shared, rags passed from one body to the next, no chance of isolation. Fevered men sweated through the night, their bodies aching, their breath foul. And still they were pressed against others because warmth mattered more than fear of disease. In the morning, the weak were dragged to roll call whether they could stand or not. The sick had no place to hide. The guards sometimes entered at night, their boots thudding on the frozen floor. Keys rattled, orders barked, names called. Men were pulled from bunks, dragged into the cold, beaten for imagined offences. Women shrank under blankets, praying they wouldn't be chosen, praying the guards' eyes would slide past them. The barrack held its breath in those moments, silent louder than the wind outside. Then the boots left, the door slammed, and everyone exhaled, shivering not just from cold, but from relief. There was no privacy in the gulag, not even at night. Every movement, every sound, every smell was shared. You heard your neighbour's stomach growl, smelled his breath, felt his body twitch against yours. You couldn't turn away. You couldn't create space. You learned to ignore it, to pretend it didn't matter, to sink into the numbness that made endurance possible. But it always mattered. It always wore you down. Nightmares were constant. Prisoners dreamed of home, of wives and children, of bread and warmth. They dreamed of escape, running through snow so deep their legs froze, only to be caught again, dragged back, beaten until they could no longer stand. Some woke crying, others woke silent, their eyes blank, their hope burned out. Hope was dangerous in the gulag. It kept you alive, but it also made the suffering sharper. Many chose numbness instead. The morning came brutally. A whistle shrieked, doors flung open, guards shouted. Prisoners stumbled from bunks, their bodies stiff, their faces grey. They stood in lines outside, snow falling on their heads, breath fogging the air, bodies swaying with exhaustion. Some collapsed where they stood, the cold too much after the night. The rest marched to labour, axes and shovels in hand, their feet dragging, their minds already counting the hours until they could collapse again on the boards. So when you imagine winter nights in the gulag, you must strip away any thought of rest. There was no rest. There was only endurance, bodies pressed together on splintered boards, blankets too thin, stoves too weak, fear too strong. There was the sound of coughing, the stench of sickness, the silence of those who didn't wake. There was the constant ache of hunger, the sharp bite of frost, the knowledge that tomorrow would be the same if you survived to see it. The city had drafts, the countryside had silence, but the gulag had death in the air. It slept beside you, breathed on your neck, pressed against your frozen toes. And every morning you woke not because you had rested, but because you had not yet died. The calendar mattered more in winter than in summer. Days blurred into one another when the snow stayed on the ground for months, when the sky was grey and low, when the cold seemed endless. But holidays broke through that sameness, offering brief interruptions, fragile lights in the long darkness. They didn't erase the hardships of the night, the drafts, the hunger, the crowded beds, but they bent them, softened them for a while. Even if you were still shivering under the blankets, the thought of celebration made the cold easier to endure. Vodka played its part in this rhythm. It wasn't just a drink. It was warmth in a bottle, a way of fighting the frost, of dulling the hunger, of silencing the coughs and the worries. Families saved what they could. Neighbours pooled resources. Workers found ways to trade or barter for a bottle. On holidays, vodka appeared on tables even when food did not. Bread might be stale, soup might be thin, but vodka flowed, and for a few hours it made the room glow. New Year's was the most important of these nights. In a country where religion had been pushed to the margins, New Year's took on the weight of Christmas, the weight of all the winter holidays combined. Families gathered around small trees, often decorated with homemade ornaments, scraps of paper, strings of cranberries, bits of tinsel passed down year after year. A small candle flickered, casting shadows on the walls, the warmth more psychological than physical. The air was thick with anticipation, even if there was little to eat, even if the gifts were simple. Knitted mittens, a small toy, a bar of soap. On these nights, the apartment hummed with a different kind of noise. Laughter louder than usual. Voices rising in song, though off-key, though tired. The sound of glasses clinking, of toasts shouted, of vodka burned down throats. Even the coughing seemed lighter, the arguments less sharp. For a few hours people forgot the draughts that slipped under doors, the frozen water in the pipes, the hunger in their bellies. For a few hours warmth came not from stoves or radiators, but from each other. Vodka carried dangers, of course, too much, and you stumbled too much, and you fell asleep in the wrong place. Too much, and you didn't wake again. Every winter claimed lives this way. Men who drank to dull the cold, who collapsed in stairwells or on benches, their bodies found stiff by morning. Everyone knew the risks, everyone told the stories. And yet, when the bottle appeared, when the nights grew long, people still drank. It was a risk they chose, because sometimes numbness was better than endurance. Other holidays were quieter but no less meaningful. Women's Day in March, Victory Day in May, smaller commemorations scattered through the year. Each one carried rituals, each one brought people together. Even birthdays, though often simple affairs, gave reason to sit longer at the table, to share what little was left, to tell stories, to let children laugh. The cold was still there, the hunger still there, but the presence of a holiday gave permission to ignore it, if only for a night. In the countryside, holidays looked different. Vodka was still central, but food was more likely to appear. A chicken slaughtered, a pig butchered, potatoes boiled in larger pots, jars of pickled vegetables opened after months of waiting. Families gathered, not just in one house, but in clusters of houses. Neighbours walking through snow to share in the meal, toasting together until the stove glowed red and the walls echoed with laughter. Children ran in circles, their cheeks flushed, their voices piercing the heavy air. For once, the silence of rural nights broke into something vibrant, something alive. The countryside also carried older traditions, rituals that the state frowned upon, but that persisted anyway. Songs that had been sung for generations, prayers whispered over bread before it was eaten, candles lit not just for light, but for meaning. These things carried warmth of their own, intangible but real, woven into the nights as tightly as the blankets that covered the beds. For children, holidays meant stories. Parents told them about winters past, about celebrations before the war, about times when food had been more plentiful. They stretched the truth, softened the hardships, gave the children something to hold on to. Gifts were meagre, a carved toy, a scarf, a sweet if sugar had been found. But children treasured them as if they were treasures beyond price. The memory of those nights lingered longer than the hunger or the cold, carried into adulthood as proof that even in the hardest winters, joy had existed. For adults, the holidays were complicated. They were reminders of what had been lost, of what should have been. They were also dangerous, because too much talk, too much honesty after too much vodka could bring ruin. Informants didn't rest on holidays. Neighbours listened as closely in laughter as they did in silence. You learned to toast carefully, to speak warmly but vaguely, to keep your true thoughts buried, even as the vodka loosened your tongue. the cold of the night wasn't the only danger. Words could burn you faster than frost. But for all that, the holidays gave something that nothing else did, a break from monotony. They broke the long march of winter into smaller pieces, milestones you could point to, look forward to, endure toward. You counted the days not just until spring, but until the next gathering, the next toast, the next night where blankets were pulled a little higher, not just for warmth, but to cover the laughter beneath them. Vodka blurred the edges of the night, but it also amplified the closeness. Families sang together, voices cracking but still rising. Neighbours shared bottles across thin walls, poured drinks in mismatched glasses, laughed at jokes that weren't really funny. The stove glowed a little brighter, or maybe it just seemed that way. Blankets felt lighter, or maybe the bodies beneath them carried more heat after a few sips. Whatever the truth, the holidays carried warmth, even if it was fleeting, even if it was only imagined. And when the night ended, when the bottle was empty, when the laughter had faded into snores, when the candles had burned down to wax puddles, the cold returned. The draughts crept back under doors, the blankets sagged heavy with damp, the hunger pressed sharper in the morning, but the memory of warmth lingered, just enough to carry you a little further. You told yourself the next holiday would come soon. You told yourself that laughter and vodka and rare warmth were enough to push through the long winter. And sometimes that belief was enough. So holidays in the Soviet Union were not just about food or drink or ritual. They were survival strategies, carved into the calendar, marked as nights when you could forget the worst parts of life. They were nights when the cold lost some of its power, when hunger lost some of its edge, when fear stepped back for a few hours. They were fragile, fleeting, easily broken by the reality outside the window. But they mattered. They mattered because they reminded people that even in the darkest winters, even in the hardest years, life could still contain laughter, song, and warmth, however rare. Morning was not a relief. It was not light pouring through the window, warming the floor, chasing away the cold. In Soviet winters, morning meant waking up stiff, your joints aching, your skin raw, your toes numb from the night. You opened your eyes to greyness, to breath fogging in front of you, to blankets heavy with damp. The first thought was never about the day ahead. The first thought was about how cold you still were, even after hours under the covers. The bed didn't welcome you into the day. It pushed you out with aches and stiffness. The boards had pressed into your bones. The straw had shifted and poked. The mattress had sagged so badly that you spent the night curled into a hollow. Your back hurt. Your shoulders burned. Your legs cramped from sleeping half bent. If you'd shared the bed, your body was tangled with others. Your arm numb from being pinned. Your chest sore from the weight of someone leaning on you. You peeled yourself away carefully, so as not to wake them, but also quickly, because the longer you hesitated, the colder the air outside the blankets felt. The shock of that air was brutal. It hit your face, your hands, your feet as soon as you pulled the covers back. You gasped involuntarily, teeth clenched, breath sharp in your chest. Your skin prickled as the warmth you had managed to trap evaporated instantly. It was the hardest part of the day, leaving the blankets, no matter how inadequate they had been. Some people lingered, pulling the covers over their heads, delaying the moment. Others forced themselves up immediately, knowing that hesitation only made it worse. Either way, it was a battle. The room was no warmer than when you had gone to sleep. Frost still clung to the windows, sometimes even to the walls. The floor was like ice under bare feet. Shoes were stiff, socks damp, coats cold to the touch. You dressed quickly, fumbling with buttons, layering sweaters, wrapping scarves. Your fingers were stiff, your nails blue, your breath visible in the dim light. Dressing didn't bring comfort. It just prepared you to face the rest of the morning. Children protested, whining as they were dragged from under the blankets. Their faces were flushed, their hair matted, their toes curled in refusal to touch the floor. Mothers scolded them gently, urging them to move, to dress, to eat. Fathers pulled on boots in silence, their faces heavy, their bodies still aching from the night. Everyone was tired. No one felt rested. The night had not restored anything. It had only kept them alive long enough to reach the morning. In the countryside, the first task was the stove. Someone always had to rise earlier than the rest, to coax the embers back into flame, to feed the fire before the house froze completely. This job often fell to the women, who stumbled out of bed in the dark, their hands raw from handling wood, their breath visible as they bent to blow into the ashes. The crackle of the first flames was the real alarm clock of the house. The smell of smoke filled the air, heavy but reassuring, proof that the cold would at least be held at bay for a little longer. Children stirred when they heard it. Parents sighed in relief. Without the stove, there was no day. In the city, the hope was always that the pipes would groan awake. People pressed their hands to radiators, waiting for warmth that sometimes came and sometimes didn't. If it came, the hiss of steam and the slow spreading heat felt like a victory. If it didn't, you wrapped yourself tighter and accepted that you would work, eat, and live in the same chill that had carried you through the night. Complaints were muttered under breath, never too loudly, because even frozen pipes could not be criticised openly. You made do, because you had no other choice. Breakfast was meagre. Bread again, if you had it. A slice shared between children. The crust chewed slowly to stretch the illusion of fullness. Soup reheated from the night before. Cabbage wilted. Potatoes soft. Water thin. Tea if you were lucky. Hot water if you weren't. The smell of food lingered but never filled the room the way hunger demanded. You ate in silence, your stomach grumbling even after the bowl was empty. The hunger from the night simply carried into the day, a constant companion. The fatigue carried too. Sleep in these winters was shallow, fragmented, interrupted by coughing, by draughts, by fear. You woke more tired than you had gone to bed, your body sluggish, your mind dulled. But the day didn't wait. Work demanded you, the factory whistle blew, the fields called. You rubbed your eyes, splashed your face with icy water, and forced yourself forward. Rest was not part of the rhythm. Endurance was. Children trudged to school, their faces hidden in scarves, their fingers stiff inside thin gloves. They stumbled through snowbanks, their breath frosting their eyelashes, their noses running. They carried books wrapped in rags, their bellies empty, their eyes heavy. Teachers scolded them for yawning, but the children couldn't help it. They hadn't slept deeply in months. Their nights were too cold, their mornings too early, their stomachs too hollow. But they went because school was not optional, because education was as mandatory as hunger. Adults marched to work in long lines, boots crunching on snow, breath rising like smoke. They carried tools, lunch pails empty except for a crust of bread, or a potato. Their bodies were stiff, their minds dull, but the rhythm of the day pushed them forward. Factories clanged, fields stretched frozen and grey, offices filled with typewriters clacking. No one asked if anyone had slept well. It was assumed no one had. Sleep was not for comfort. It was for survival. And survival was expected of everyone. The mornings were hardest after nights of drinking. Holidays and vodka blurred the pain of the cold, but the hangovers were merciless. Men groaned as they dragged themselves from beds, their heads pounding, their throats raw. Women scowled as they cleaned up the remnants. Glasses left sticky on tables, crumbs frozen to plates, bottles empty on windowsills. Children giggled at the sight of their parents stumbling, but they felt the same cold pressing on their toes. Vodka softened the night, but it made the morning sharper. The cold never forgave indulgence. In the gulag, morning was brutal beyond imagination. The whistle blew before dawn, the guards shouted, doors slammed. Prisoners stumbled from bunks, their bodies aching, their skin cracked from frostbite. They stood in the snow for roll call, their feet numb, their stomachs growling, their eyes hollow. Some collapsed before the day even began, dragged aside like broken tools. The others marched to labour, the cold biting harder than any whip. Night in the gulag didn't refresh. It only delayed death by a few more hours. Everywhere the cycle repeated. Sleep was shallow, mornings were cold, the day was labour, the night was hunger, the bed was no refuge, and the morning came again. People joked about it sometimes, calling it the eternal winter, laughing at their own misery. The laughter was thin, but it was real. Humour was another way of surviving, another way of warming yourself for a moment. But even laughter couldn't melt the frost on the windows, and so you woke frozen day after day. Day! You woke with stiff fingers, with numb toes, with an ache in your back, with hunger in your belly. You woke knowing you would do it all again tonight. The same drafts, the same blankets, the same fights over space in the bed, the same noises from neighbours, the same nightmares, the same struggle to hold warmth in your body until morning. There was no escape from it. Not in the cities, not in the countryside, not even in the barracks of the gulag. The cold was always there, waiting for you at night, greeting you in the morning. It pressed into your bones, lived in your clothes, followed you in your breath. And every day began with the same truth. You had survived the night, but the night would come again. So when you think of Soviet winters, don't picture one frozen night. Picture thousands of them, stacked one after the other, stretching for years. Picture families waking frozen, children crying, adults silent, neighbours coughing through walls. Picture the same motions repeated endlessly, blankets pulled back, boots laced stiff, hands rubbed together for warmth, faces bent against the cold. Picture the cycle, unbroken, relentless, endured again and again until spring finally arrived. And even then, the memory of those mornings lingered, heavy as the frost itself. When you think back on those nights, the picture is not of one bed, one family, one street. It is of millions of them, scattered across a vast country, each one enduring the same cycle in slightly different ways. The Soviet winter did not care if you lived in a tower block in Moscow, in a wooden hut in Siberia, or in a barrack behind barbed wire. The cold entered all of them, seeped through all of them, pressed its weight on everyone who lay down at night. It was the equalizer, cutting through every difference of age, of class, of place. and it returned without fail, year after year, longer and harder than anyone wanted to admit. Night was never a retreat from the day. It was a continuation of it, an extension of the same battle. You carried the hunger from the dinner table into the bed. You carried the damp smell of unwashed clothes into the blankets. You carried the silence of the countryside, the noise of the city, the fear of the gulag, all of it into your dreams. The bed was not a space apart. It was just another front line. You didn't collapse into comfort. You collapsed into the same fight, only horizontal. The cold had no mercy for the smallest or the weakest. Babies wrapped in endless rags. Children curled up with their toes tucked into the stomachs of siblings. The elderly pressed against walls that never warmed. The cold pressed into all of them equally. Parents lay awake, listening to the wheeze of their children's breathing, the cough of their own mothers, the groan of the pipes that might or might not bring warmth that night. Even when you slept, you listened. You couldn't turn it off. The night didn't allow it. And the mornings were never a release. They came grey and bitter, the same frost on the window, the same stiffness in your joints, the same hunger waiting for bread that wasn't there. The bed spit you back into the day, as unrefreshed as when you had entered it. You pulled on stiff boots, laced them with numb fingers, wrapped a scarf around your face, and stepped back into the snow. You worked, you queued, you argued quietly in kitchens, you chopped wood in forests, you listened for footsteps in stairwells, you nodded silently to guards. Then night came again, and you returned to the same bed, the same drafts, the same heavy quilts, the same crowded breaths. The cycle didn't break. You lived inside it. The ingenuity people showed to fight it was small but constant. Stuffing rags into cracks, taping paper to windows, boiling water to pour into jars that cooled too fast, sewing socks until the thread wore away. None of it worked for long. The cold found its way back. But people tried anyway, because trying gave the illusion of control, gave the sense that you were not entirely powerless. Even as you curled under blankets that smelled of mildew, even as you shivered against your neighbour's shoulder, even as your toes ached inside patched socks, you told yourself you had done something to resist. Vodka blurred the edges of the cold. Laughter dulled its sharpness. Songs carried you over it for a few hours. But the cold was patient. It waited. When the bottle was empty, when the laughter died down, when the last voice fell silent, the cold was still there, seeping through the walls, brushing against your face, stiffening your fingers. It always won in the end. Not by killing outright, though it did that too, but by exhausting you, by grinding you down night after night until fatigue became your natural state. The gulag showed the cold at its most brutal, stripped of every protection, weaponized as punishment. But the difference between the barrack and the apartment was only in degree, not in kind. Both were filled with damp, both pressed bodies together, both echoed with coughs and snores and nightmares. In one place you woke to a factory whistle, in another to a guard's shout, but the feeling was the same. The night had not given you rest. It had only delayed the demands of the day. Dreams were not escapes. They carried hunger, fear, and cold into distorted shapes that followed you into waking. You dreamed of bread, of warmth, of silence, and woke with none of it. You dreamed of footsteps in stairwells, of doors opening, of names called in the night, and woke with your heart pounding, unsure if it had been real. Even in sleep, you were not free of vigilance. the night didn't let go. And so the memory of Soviet winters is not one of isolated moments, but of continuity. Of night after night, morning after morning, the same motions repeated until they became the texture of life itself. To live, then, was to wake frozen, and to do it again. To go to bed with hunger, and to wake with hunger. To fall asleep listening to coughing, and to wake to the same cough. To endure one night only so you could endure the next. The cycle did not break until the thaw came, and even then the relief was temporary. The next winter always waited. Children who grew up in those winters carried the memory forever. They remembered the arguments over who got to sleep against the wall, the way their toes never felt warm, the way their parents' bodies surrounded them like shields against the drafts. They remembered the nights on stoves, the smell of smoke in their hair, the way laughter and songs sometimes softened the hunger for a while. They grew into adults who understood cold not as weather, but as a permanent condition of life. Even in warmer years, even in new apartments, even after the Soviet Union itself fell, the memory of those winters lingered. It shaped the way they moved, the way they thought, the way they remembered sleep. And those who didn't grow up in it, who only read about it or heard fragments from their elders, often misunderstood. They imagined a cold night as something extraordinary, something unusual. But for those who lived it, it was not extraordinary at all. It was ordinary, constant, relentless. It wasn't a story of one particularly harsh winter, but of many stacked one upon another, filling entire decades. It wasn't something you escaped. It was something you carried. The truth of those nights is not in a single dramatic moment, not in a single image of frostbitten windows or thin blankets. It is in the repetition, the endless sameness, the way the cold entered every detail of life. It is in the way people pulled blankets tighter without thinking, in the way they pressed closer together at night, in the way they layered socks and coats and scarves even in bed. It is in the way children cried out from hunger or from cold toes, in the way parents hushed them with promises they couldn't keep. It is in the way neighbours coughed through the walls, in the way footsteps in the stairwell silenced entire apartments, in the way guards' boots echoed through barracks. It is in the way people still woke up in the morning, still got dressed, still went out into the snow to work, still did it again. And that is what Soviet winter nights were. Not isolated hardships, but an endless cycle. You went to bed hungry, cold, frightened. You woke hungry, cold, frightened. You endured the day, returned to the bed, endured the night, woke again. There was no relief, only endurance, and endurance became life itself.